Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The isolation was exactly what I'd been searching for when I drove out from Fairbanks that morning 3 days ago. The White Mountains stretched endlessly before me, their peaks dusted with patches of snow that refused to melt even in late summer. I'd chosen this particular trail specifically because it was known for being deserted. Most hikers preferred the more scenic routes closer to town, leaving this northern path to the occasional hunter or those seeking true solitude. My campsite sat nestled between two ridges, protected from the worst of the wind, but open enough to see anyone approaching from the main trail. I'd spent the first day setting up methodically, tent positioned for optimal morning sun, bear canister secured 30 yards away, fire ring constructed from stones I'd gathered from a nearby creek bed. The second day passed in peaceful routine. Coffee at dawn, a long hike to photograph the valley below, evening spent reading by the fire. Now, on my third day, I'd settled into a comfortable rhythm. The noon sun filtered through the sparse canopy of black spruce and paper birch, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. I'd built my fire early, unusual for midday, but the dampness from last night's rain made me crave the warmth and the familiar comfort of tending flames. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the earthy scent of moss and wet pine needles as I prepared a simple meal of freeze-dried stew. The wilderness had been remarkably quiet during my stay. No bears shuffling through the underbrush, no moose crashing through the willows, not even the usual chatter of gray jays or ravens. The absence of wildlife should have struck me as odd, but I attributed it to the recent weather. Animals often stayed hidden after heavy rains. The man materialized from nowhere. One moment I was alone, stirring my meal and watching the hypnotic dance of flames. The next he stood at the edge of my campsite. No warning, no footsteps crunching through the undergrowth, no shadow falling across the periphery of my vision. He simply existed where emptiness had been seconds before. My hand jerked, sending hot stew splattering across my boots. The sudden presence of another human after days of solitude felt like a physical intrusion, as jarring as a scream in a library. He stood perhaps 20 feet away, wearing standard hiking gear, brown boots caked with mud, cargo pants with numerous pockets, a faded blue jacket that had seen better days. His backpack, an older external frame model, showed signs of heavy use. Nothing about his appearance seemed immediately threatening, yet something in the way he stood too still, too focused, made my skin prickle. "Sorry to startle you," he said, though his tone carried no actual apology. His voice had an unusual quality, flat and measured, like someone reading from a script they'd memorized but didn't understand. "I'm looking for the cabin, the shelter. Do you know where it is?" I knew immediately what he meant. These mountains were dotted with old public-use cabins, remnants from the days when the Forest Service maintained emergency shelters throughout the back country. Most had fallen into disrepair, abandoned to rot and weather, but hikers still used them occasionally. During my exploration yesterday, I'd noticed a narrow path branching off from the main trail, probably leading to one such structure. "There's a side trail about 10 minutes that way," I said, pointing northeast through the trees. "Narrow opening between two large spruces. If there's a cabin around here, that's probably your best bet." He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving my face. His eyes were pale gray, the color of old ice, and they didn't blink as often as they should. 10 minutes. Between two spruces." He repeated my words without inflection, then turned and walked away, moving through the forest with an odd mechanical gait. The encounter left me unsettled in ways I couldn't articulate. I tried to return to my meal, but the food had gone cold and my appetite had vanished. The forest, which had felt like a peaceful sanctuary moments before, now seemed to press in from all sides. Every small sound, a branch creaking in the wind, a pine cone dropping to the ground, made me look up sharply. I spent the afternoon trying to recapture my earlier tranquility. I walked down to the creek to filter water, organized my gear, collected more firewood, but concentration proved impossible. My thoughts kept returning to the stranger. How had he approached so silently? The ground around my camp was covered in dry leaves and brittle twigs that announced every step I took. Yet he'd appeared without warning, as if he'd materialized from the air itself. As evening approached, the quality of light began to change. This far north in Alaska, summer darkness never fully arrives. Instead, the sun hovers at the horizon for hours, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. It creates a perpetual twilight that plays tricks on your eyes, making distances hard to judge, and turning ordinary objects into vague, threatening shapes. I was adding more wood to the fire, preparing for my last night before heading home tomorrow, when movement in the trees caught my attention. A figure emerged from the forest, the same man from earlier. My stomach tightened. He'd been gone for 8 or 9 hours. If he'd found the cabin, why wasn't he there now? If he hadn't found it, what had he been doing all this time? Couldn't find it, he said before I could speak. His clothes looked exactly the same as before. No additional dirt, no scratches from pushing through brush, no signs he'd been wandering the woods for hours. I looked where you said, but there's no trail. I need you to show me. Every instinct screamed against going with him, but he stood there patient and unmoving, and began to speak about not having a tent, about counting on that shelter, about the temperature dropping tonight. His words were reasonable, but his delivery remained eerily flat, like a bad actor reading lines. Guilt wrestled with caution in my mind. What if he really was just a lost hiker who needed help? Against my better judgment, I grabbed my pack, wallet, phone, keys, everything important was in there, and agreed to show him the trail. It couldn't be more than a 10-minute walk. I'd point out the path, make sure he saw it, then return to my camp. We moved through the forest in uncomfortable silence. He walked behind me, maintaining a constant distance of about 6 feet. I could hear his breathing, steady and rhythmic, never changing pace even when we climbed over fallen logs or pushed through thick undergrowth. The forest seemed to hold its breath around us. No birds called. No small animals rustled in the underbrush. Even the wind had stilled. The trail appeared exactly where I remembered, a narrow gap between 2 massive spruce trees, their lower branches creating a natural archway. Beyond that, a faint path wound through the vegetation, barely visible but definitely there. And in the distance, perhaps 200 yards away, I could make out the dark angular shape of a structure through the trees. There, I said, pointing. The trail, just like I told you. And you can see the cabin from here. But he wasn't looking at the cabin. He stared at me with those pale eyes, his expression unchanged. That's not the right cabin, he said. We continued walking despite my growing anxiety. Each step felt like wading through thick mud, my body resisting even as my feet moved forward. The cabin grew larger as we approached, its details becoming horrifyingly clear. The structure had been abandoned for decades. The roof sagged inward, creating a valley that collected debris and rot. Windows hung broken and empty like dead eyes. The door stood partially open, revealing only darkness beyond. Green-black mold covered the walls in spreading stains, and the smell of decay grew stronger with each step. I stopped about 30 feet from the entrance, unable to shake the feeling that crossing that threshold would be crossing into something I'd never return from. The doorway seemed to exhale cold air that carried the scent of earth and decomposition. We should go back, I started to say, turning toward my companion. He stood 10 feet behind me, and in his right hand held a knife. Not a camping knife or multi-tool, but a fixed-blade hunting knife with a worn leather handle. The blade caught the fading sunlight, revealing scratches and stains along its edge. His transformation was complete yet subtle. Same clothes, same face, but everything about his posture had shifted. He looked predatory now, coiled and ready. Go inside. His voice had lost even the pretense of emotion. It was mechanical, hollow, the voice of someone who had disconnected from their humanity.
What are you?
Go, inside. The knife didn't waver. His grip was practiced, comfortable. This wasn't his first time holding someone at knife point. My mind raced through options, adrenaline flooding my system with painful intensity. The cabin behind me was a trap, confined space, probably only one exit, him blocking it with a weapon. But the forest around us offered possibilities. I dropped my pack and ran. The decision was instantaneous, my body moving before conscious thought formed. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes, roots trying to trip me. I expected to hear him behind me, footsteps pounding, branches breaking, harsh breathing growing closer, but there was nothing. After 50 yards, I risked a glance back. He stood exactly where I'd left him, still holding the knife, watching me flee with the patience of someone who knew something I didn't. I kept running until my lungs burned and my legs shook. Finally, I found a cluster of fallen trees that created a natural hiding spot. I wedged myself into the hollow they formed, trying to control my ragged breathing. The forest had grown darker, shadows stretching and merging into pools of blackness between the trees. I waited, listening for any sign of pursuit, but heard only my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. 30 minutes passed. Maybe 40. Time becomes elastic when you're hiding for your life. Every small sound sent fresh waves of panic through me. A squirrel moving through the canopy became footsteps. Wind through leaves became whispered words. But gradually, my rational mind began to reassert itself. I needed my pack. Everything important was in it. My car keys, phone identification. Without those things, I was truly stranded. Moving carefully, testing each step before putting my weight down, I crept back toward the cabin. The forest had become a maze of shadows and half-seen shapes. Tree trunks looked like standing figures until I got close enough to see bark and branches. When the cabin finally came into view, I stopped and watched. No movement, no sign of the man. My pack was gone. I made my way back to my campsite, every nerve screaming with tension. The forest path I'd walked dozens of times now felt alien and threatening. Each familiar landmark, the bent pine, the moss-covered boulder, the creek crossing, seemed changed, as if I was seeing their true nature for the first time. The orange glow became visible through the trees before I reached camp. My fire, which should have died to embers hours ago, burned bright and high. Fresh wood had been added, flames reaching upward into the perpetual twilight. My tent remained where I'd pitched it, apparently untouched. And there, placed deliberately in the center of the cleared area where anyone approaching would see it, sat my pack. The setup was so obviously a trap that it felt insulting. He knew I'd come back for the cabin, knew I'd find my pack missing, knew I'd return here looking for it. And now he wanted me to know that he knew. The pack sat there like bait in a snare, daring me to try retrieving it. I circled the campsite from the cover of the trees, moving slowly, examining every shadow. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling upward. Then I heard it, a low humming, tuneless and repetitive. He emerged from the darkness on the far side of the fire, carrying an armload of branches. He fed them to the flames with casual efficiency, then sat down on a log I'd been using as a bench. The knife was no longer visible, but I knew it was there, probably within easy reach. He sat facing the direction he knew I'd approach from, humming that mindless tune, waiting with inhuman patience. The message was clear. Your move. I backed away slowly, each step calculated to make no sound. Once I'd put sufficient distance between us, I found the main trail and began the long journey back to the road. Walking through that endless twilight, every shadow could have hidden him. Every sound might have been his footsteps. The trail seemed to stretch forever, time distorting until minutes felt like hours. My feet bled inside my boots by the time I reached the trailhead parking area. No vehicles remained except for a rusted Forest Service information board. I walked the dirt road toward the highway, legs mechanical and numb. It took 3 hours before headlights appeared in the distance. The elderly couple who stopped looked terrified when they saw me. Torn clothes, scratched face, eyes wild with exhaustion and fear, but they drove me to the nearest town, where I called the police from a gas station. The authorities responded quickly, sending officers and rangers to investigate at first light. They found nothing. My campsite had been erased. The tent, the fire ring, my gear, all gone. Even the stones I'd carefully arranged for the fire pit had been scattered back into the forest. The spot where I'd camped for 3 days looked as if no human had ever been there. The rangers confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. The cabin was officially discontinued, removed from maps, no longer maintained or monitored. It existed in a bureaucratic limbo, neither preserved nor demolished, simply abandoned to rot in the wilderness. The perfect place for someone who didn't want to be found. The perfect place to take someone who wouldn't be missed immediately. I've never returned to those mountains. I've replaced all my gear, changed my locks even though he never had my keys, installed security cameras around my home. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I think about him still sitting by that fire, humming tunelessly, waiting with infinite patience for the next helpful hiker to come along. I think about how close I came to walking into that cabin, how one different decision would have meant never walking out. The authorities never found any trace of him. No matching missing persons reports. No similar incidents reported. He vanished as completely as he'd appeared, leaving only the memory of pale gray eyes and a voice empty of humanity. But I know he's still out there, somewhere in those endless woods, waiting. The thought follows me like a shadow I can never quite escape. That somewhere in the White Mountains, in a rotting cabin that doesn't officially exist, someone is standing perfectly still, holding a knife, practicing their lines for the next unwary camper who stops to help a lost hiker find shelter for the night. The wilderness doesn't frighten me anymore. It's the people you might find there. The ones who use isolation as a hunting ground, who understand that helpfulness can be weaponized against good people. Every solo camper should remember. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't getting lost, it's being found by someone who was never lost at all. I've been hiking for 37 years, since my college days back in the mid-80s, and I thought I'd seen everything these American wilderness areas had to offer. I've walked the Appalachian Trail 3 times, spent weeks in Yellowstone, hiked through Death Valley in carefully planned winter expeditions, and pushed myself through the punishing terrain of the North Cascades. The familiar trails had become too predictable, too sanitized by their popularity and the constant presence of other hikers. I needed something raw, something untouched. That's how I developed my unusual method of finding new places to explore. I'd spend hours late at night, sitting at my computer with a glass of whiskey, scrolling through Google Maps satellite view. I was looking for those vast stretches of green that had no trails marked, no parking areas indicated, no helpful little pins suggesting scenic overlooks or camping spots. Just pure unnamed forest that most people would drive past without a second thought. My preparation was always meticulous. I'd researched and developed my own system using custom stickers, bright orange circles about 3 inches in diameter, coated with a removable adhesive strong enough to stay put but gentle enough not to damage tree bark. I'd mark my route every 100 yards or so, always at shoulder height on my right-hand side, creating a breadcrumb trail that I could follow back to my starting point. On the return journey, I'd peel each one off carefully and stuff them in my pack. Leave no trace, that was my religion. The system had never failed me. In 8 years of using this method, exploring dozens of unmarked forests across New England and beyond, I'd never gotten lost, never had a close call, never even felt seriously concerned about finding my way back. I'd encountered black bears, startled deer, nearly stepped on a rattlesnake in Pennsylvania, but the wilderness had always felt manageable, comprehensible. Dudleytown Forest in Connecticut had been on my radar for almost a year before I finally decided to tackle it. I'd read the stories, of course, the legends about the cursed village, the families that had supposedly gone mad there, the mysterious deaths and disappearances. All of it was nonsense as far as I was concerned. People love to spin tales about abandoned places, to project their fears onto empty buildings and overgrown foundations. The real reason Dudleytown interested me was simple. It was officially closed to the public, which meant it was likely to be genuinely isolated. I picked a Tuesday in mid-October for my expedition. The fall colors were past their peak. Most of the tourists had gone home, and the weather forecast promised clear skies and temperatures in the low 50s, perfect hiking conditions. I loaded my pack the night before. Water, emergency supplies, first aid kit, GPS device, fully charged phone, energy bars, my roll of orange stickers, headlamp, and a lightweight emergency blanket. I even left a note on my kitchen counter with my planned route and expected return time, though I lived alone and it might be days before anyone found it if something went wrong. The drive from my apartment in Worcester took about 2 hours. I arrived at the unmarked access point around 11:30 in the morning, parking my Honda on a wide shoulder where the trees pressed close to the road. Before entering, I stood at the forest's edge for several minutes, just observing. The tree line was thick with white pines and bare-limbed oaks. No signs warned against trespassing here, though I knew they existed at the more well-known entrances. I shouldered my pack, checked my phone one last time, 2 bars of service, and stepped into the woods. The change was immediate and jarring. One moment I was standing beside my car, hearing the distant sound of traffic on the main road, the rustle of leaves, a crow calling from somewhere overhead. The next moment, as I pushed through the initial wall of undergrowth and moved perhaps 20 feet into the forest, all of that vanished. Not gradually, abruptly, as if someone had flipped a switch. I stopped walking and held my breath, listening. Nothing. No birds, no insects, no small animals rustling through the leaf litter. No breeze moving through the branches above. In all my years of hiking, I'd never experienced silence quite like this. It felt almost physical, like a pressure against my eardrums. I could hear my heartbeat, the sound of my own breathing, the creak of my pack straps when I shifted my weight. I tried to rationalize it. Sometimes forests go quiet when a predator is near. Animals freeze and wait for danger to pass. But this was different. This felt like the absence of animals entirely, as if I'd wandered into some dead zone where nothing lived. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos, though I wasn't sure why. The images would just show ordinary trees and forest floor, nothing that would capture the wrongness of the atmosphere. I pressed forward, reminding myself that I'd come here precisely because it was unusual. After about 10 minutes of walking, I attached my first orange sticker to a pine tree at shoulder height, pressing firmly to ensure it would hold. The small familiar action was comforting. I had my system. I had my way out. The terrain was relatively easy at first. Gentle slopes, sparse undergrowth, good visibility between the trees. I maintained a steady pace, placing a sticker every 100 yards just as I always did. I kept expecting the forest to come alive, to hear a squirrel chattering, or see a bird flit between branches, but the silence persisted. Even the sound of my boots on the forest floor seemed muffled, absorbed by something I couldn't identify. After about 45 minutes, I found myself in a small clearing where the tree cover thinned out. Sunlight streamed through, and I could see patches of blue sky. I sat on a fallen log and drank some water, trying to shake off the growing unease. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that there was nothing objectively wrong. Forests could be quiet. Animals sometimes avoided certain areas due to lack of food or water. There could be a dozen mundane explanations. But something primitive in my brain, some ancient survival instinct, was screaming at me to leave. The silence felt wrong. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I found myself listening so intently that my ears started playing tricks on me, creating phantom sounds from pure silence. I'd think I heard something, and whip my head around, only to find nothing but empty woods staring back at me. I forced myself to eat an energy bar even though my appetite had vanished. I needed to maintain my strength, and I'd learned long ago that letting yourself get hungry in the wilderness was a rookie mistake. As I chewed the tasteless bar, I made a decision. I'd continue for another hour, then turn back. That would give me a decent exploration of the area without pushing too deep into unfamiliar territory. Standing up to continue, I noticed something odd. In the clearing's center, there was a circular patch where nothing grew. Not even weeds or moss, just bare dirt, maybe 6 feet in diameter, perfectly round. I walked over to examine it more closely. The soil looked normal, no different from the ground around it. No signs of fire or chemical contamination. No reason I could identify for why nothing would grow there. I took another photo and moved on, making a mental note to research whether such bare spots were a known phenomenon in this area. I'd been walking for about another 20 minutes when I heard it. At first I thought I was imagining things, my ears fabricating sound to fill the oppressive silence. But no, there it was again. A long, wavering wail that seemed to come from somewhere ahead and to my left. I froze mid-step, one foot still raised, barely breathing. The sound was like nothing I'd ever encountered. It wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human. It had a quality that made my skin crawl, a keening quality that spoke of pain or distress or something worse. The wail rose and fell, lasting maybe 10 seconds before fading away, leaving the forest silent once more. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to check the time. 1:47 p.m. I had plenty of daylight left, but suddenly that didn't matter. Every instinct I had was telling me to turn around right now and get out of these woods. But I stood there, paralyzed by indecision and a morbid curiosity that I'd come to regret. The sound came again, slightly different this time, higher pitched, more urgent. I tried to place it. Could it be wind moving through a cave or hollow tree? But there was no wind. I couldn't feel even the slightest breeze. An injured animal? Possible, but what kind of animal? It didn't sound like any creature I was familiar with, and I'd heard a lot of animal sounds in my years of hiking. Coyotes, Mountain lions, bears, elk, none of them sounded like this. I realized I was gripping my phone so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. I forced myself to relax my hand and put the phone away. I needed to make a decision. The logical choice was to turn back now, but part of me resisted. I'd driven 2 hours to get here. I'd barely explored a square mile of forest. Was I really going to let a strange noise, probably just some weird acoustic effect, send me running back to my car? I compromised with myself. I'd walk away from the sound, perpendicular to my current path, for 15 minutes. If I encountered anything else unusual, that would be my signal to leave. But I wasn't going to abandon an entire expedition because of one weird noise. I was a grown man, an experienced hiker, not some kid afraid of shadows. I altered my course, moving to the right, away from where the wailing seemed to originate. I placed my stickers as I went, though my hands weren't as steady as usual. The silence had returned, so complete that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I kept glancing over my shoulder, though I wasn't sure what I expected to see. The 15 minutes passed without incident. No more wailing, no other unusual sounds, nothing but the oppressive quiet and the endless trees. I was beginning to feel foolish for my earlier panic. This was just an ordinary forest, albeit an unusually quiet one. The sound had probably been wind through rock formations or some other natural phenomenon that I simply wasn't familiar with. I was about to turn around and head back when I noticed the trees around me. Something was off about them, though it took me a moment to identify what. Then I saw it. Carvings in the bark. Not recent carvings. The exposed wood had darkened with age, suggesting they'd been there for years, maybe decades. But they weren't the typical heart and initials carvings you might find near any popular hiking spot. These were symbols. Strange angular marks that didn't resemble any alphabet I recognized. I approached the nearest carved tree slowly, as if it might somehow react to my presence. The symbols were crude but deliberate, cut deep into the bark. There were 3 of them arranged vertically. A slash mark, a circle with a line through it, and something that looked like a backward letter F. The cuts were old enough that the tree had begun to heal around them, the bark starting to close over the wounds. Looking around, I saw that at least a dozen nearby trees bore similar markings. Some had just 1 or 2 symbols, others were covered with them. The patterns didn't repeat exactly. Each tree seemed to have its own unique combination. I pulled out my phone and photographed several of them, trying to capture the details clearly. My hands were shaking again, making it difficult to keep the camera steady. Who had made these carvings, and why? They were too numerous and too deliberately placed to be random vandalism. They reminded me of trail markers, but they didn't seem to indicate any particular direction or route. Maybe they were territorial markers of some kind. But for whom? Hikers didn't mark territory. Hunters might, but these symbols seemed too elaborate for that purpose. I ran my fingers over one of the carvings, feeling the deep grooves in the wood. The bark felt cold and slightly damp, though it hadn't rained in days. A thought occurred to me that sent a fresh wave of unease through my body. What if someone was still maintaining these marks? What if I wasn't alone in these woods? That's when I decided I'd had enough. Strange silence, unexplained wailing, mysterious carvings. 3 strikes was more than enough reason to call it a day. I'd satisfied my curiosity about Dudleytown Forest, and I'd be perfectly happy never returning. I turned around and began retracing my steps, looking for my orange stickers. I found the first one easily enough, right where I'd left it on a birch tree. I peeled it off and stuffed it in my jacket pocket, then looked ahead for the next one. There it was, about 100 yards away, visible as a bright orange dot against the gray and brown forest. I walked to it, removed it, pocketed it, and looked for the next. This pattern continued for perhaps 10 minutes. I was making good time, moving faster than I had on the way in, motivated by a strong desire to get back to my car and leave this place behind. The stickers were spaced exactly as I remembered, each one leading me reliably toward the next. Then something changed. The next sticker I came to seemed lower than the others. Not dramatically lower, but noticeable. Instead of being at my shoulder height, about 5.5 feet off the ground, it was at my waist, maybe 3.5 feet up. I stood there staring at it, my brain struggling to process this anomaly. Had I placed this one while crouching for some reason? That didn't make sense. I was meticulous about consistency. Every sticker went at shoulder height, no exceptions. It was a fundamental part of my system, but here it was, unmistakably lower than it should be, still stuck to the tree trunk, still the same bright orange color. I removed it slowly, examining it as if it might somehow explain itself. It was identical to all the others. Same size, same adhesive backing, same marker number written on the back. I'd numbered them sequentially as I'd gone along, and this one's number matched where it should be in the sequence. But the height was wrong. I looked ahead for the next sticker, my heart beginning to pound harder. There it was, and even from a distance I could see it was also too low, and beyond it, another one, also at waist height. I started walking faster, my breath coming in short gasps, removing each sticker as I passed it. All of them were too low. All of them had been moved. My mind raced through possibilities. Could I have been wrong about placing them at shoulder height? No, absolutely not. I'd been using this system for years. It was automatic, unthinking, like muscle memory. Could the trees have somehow grown? No, that was ridiculous. Trees don't grow noticeably in a matter of hours. That left only one explanation. Someone had moved them. Someone had followed my trail, peeled off each sticker, and replaced it lower down on the same tree. Someone had altered my breadcrumb trail. But why? Why would anyone do that? The answer came to me with horrible clarity, to lead me somewhere different from where I'd actually come from. Someone was trying to get me lost. Or worse, someone was trying to lead me somewhere specific. I started running, no longer caring about being quiet or conserving energy. I needed to get out of these woods immediately. The stickers couldn't be trusted anymore. I pulled out my phone as I ran, praying I'd have enough signal to check my GPS. The screen showed my location, but the map was blank except for my blue dot. No trails, no landmarks, just the vague outline of the forest boundary. I could see which direction I needed to go to reach my car, but I had no way to know what obstacles might lie between here and there. At least the phone was working. At least I had that. I held it in front of me as I ran, using it like a compass, constantly adjusting my direction to keep moving toward the road where I'd parked. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching for me like skeletal fingers. My pack bounced against my back with each step, the straps digging into my shoulders. I'd covered maybe 200 yards when I saw something ahead that stopped me cold. There was a dark opening between two massive boulders, a cave or crevice of some kind, and leading right to it at waist height on the surrounding trees were my orange stickers. Someone had created a false trail that led directly to that dark opening. I stood there, gasping for breath, staring at that cave entrance. I had never been this way before. I was certain of it. This wasn't on my original route. Someone had moved my stickers to create a new path, a path that ended at that cave. The cave where presumably something or someone was waiting for me. Terror gripped me then, pure and primal. I turned away from the cave and sprinted in the direction my phone indicated, abandoning any attempt to follow markers. Branches whipped at my face and tore at my jacket. I crashed through undergrowth, stumbled over hidden roots, but I didn't slow down. Behind me, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The wailing had started again. This time, the wailing was different. Before it had seemed distant, directionless. Now it came from a specific location, behind me, and to the left, roughly where that cave entrance had been. And it was moving. With each second it seemed to be getting closer. I ran harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. I was 53 years old, 20 pounds overweight, and running like a man half my age fleeing for his life. Because that's exactly what I was doing. I crashed through the forest without any attempt at stealth or strategy, just pure panic-driven flight. The wailing rose and fell, a horrible undulating sound that seemed designed to inspire terror. It didn't sound like any whistle or instrument I'd ever heard. It sounded organic, alive, furious, and it was definitely getting closer. I could hear something crashing through the undergrowth behind me, something moving fast. I risked a glance at my phone. The battery was at 30%. I'd been using it heavily for GPS and photos. The distance to my car showed as 0.4 miles. So close, but it might as well have been 10 miles, given how rough the terrain was. I had to cross a steep ravine, climb the opposite slope, and push through a dense thicket before I'd reach the road. The wailing grew louder. I could hear branches snapping behind me. the sound of something large moving through the forest with purpose and speed. I didn't look back. Looking back would slow me down, and slowing down would get me killed. I was certain of that with every fiber of my being. I hit the ravine at full speed, half running and half falling down the steep slope. My boots slipped on wet leaves and loose rocks. I grabbed at tree trunks and branches to control my descent, feeling the bark tear at my palms. Behind me, the wailing continued, now echoing weirdly in the ravine, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. At the bottom, I splashed through a narrow stream, barely 3 inches deep but numbingly cold. The icy water poured into my boots, but I didn't slow down. I attacked the opposite slope, pulling myself up using exposed roots and saplings. My pack caught on branches, but I wrenched it free and kept climbing. The wailing was so close now that it seemed to vibrate in my chest. I still hadn't seen what was making the sound, and part of me was grateful for that. Whatever it was right behind me, close enough that I could hear its breathing, a wet, ragged sound that was somehow worse than the wailing. I crested the top of the ravine and burst through the thicket, feeling thorns rip at my exposed skin. I could see lighter areas between the trees ahead, the forest thinning out near the road. I was almost there, almost safe. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text message notification. In any other circumstance, I would have ignored it, but the momentary distraction caused me to glance down at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number, just 2 words: keep running. The absurdity of receiving a text message in the middle of a life-or-death chase through a supposedly uninhabited forest almost made me laugh. A hysterical bark of sound that I choked back down. Who could possibly be texting me right now? How could anyone even know what was happening? But the message was right. I kept running. I broke through the tree line doing maybe 15 miles an hour, which might not sound like much but felt like flying given how long I'd been running. My car was there right where I'd left it, sitting peacefully on the shoulder of the road. It looked beautiful, impossibly safe and normal, like a photograph of civilization in this nightmare forest. The wailing stopped. Just like that, mid-sound, it cut off completely. The sudden silence was almost as jarring as the sound itself had been. I stumbled to a halt, one hand on my car's hood, gasping for air, and looked back at the forest. Nothing. No movement. No sound. No sign of pursuit. The forest edge looked perfectly ordinary, just trees and shadows, and afternoon sunlight filtering through the branches. Whatever had been chasing me had stopped at the tree line, as if there were some invisible barrier it couldn't or wouldn't cross. I stood there for a long moment, bent over with my hands on my knees, struggling to catch my breath and waiting for my heart rate to slow down. My entire body was shaking. My clothes were torn and dirty. My hands were bleeding from a dozen small cuts and scratches, and my right knee was throbbing where I'd slammed it against a rock during my descent into the ravine. With trembling hands, I unlocked my car and threw my pack into the back seat. I climbed behind the wheel and locked all the doors, then just sat there, staring at the forest through my windshield. Nothing moved. The woods looked empty, innocent, completely benign. I checked my phone again. The mysterious text message was still there. Keep running. I tried to reply, but the message failed to send. I tried calling the number, but it went straight to a generic voicemail. I checked my call log and message history. The number didn't appear anywhere else. It was as if the message had materialized out of thin air. My hands were shaking too badly to drive safely, so I sat there for another 10 minutes, just breathing and trying to process what had happened. The rational part of my brain was still trying to explain everything away. Someone living in the woods had moved my markers. Some animal I'd never encountered before had made that wailing sound. The text message was a prank, or a wrong number, or a glitch. But I didn't believe any of that. Deep down, in the primitive part of my brain that had screamed at me to run, I knew that something wrong lived in those woods. Something that had tried to lure me into that cave. Something that had chased me when the lure failed. I started the car and drove away, constantly checking my rearview mirror as if expecting something to emerge from the forest and pursue me onto the highway. Nothing did. The forest receded behind me, and with each mile the experience began to feel less real, more like a bad dream. That was 6 weeks ago. I haven't been hiking since. My gear sits in my garage untouched. I've stopped looking at maps, stopped planning routes, stopped thinking about unnamed forests and unexplored trails. Something fundamental has broken inside me. Some confidence or courage that I used to take for granted. I spent the first week after the incident trying to research what I'd experienced. I found the old stories about Dudley Town, the supposed curse, the families that went mad, the mysterious deaths. I dismissed all of it before, but now I read every account I could find, looking for something that matched what I'd encountered. There were stories about strange sounds in the woods, stories about people getting lost despite being experienced outdoorsmen, stories about markers and trails that led nowhere, or worse, that led somewhere you didn't want to go. A few accounts mentioned symbols carved in trees, though no one seemed to know what they meant or who had made them. I tried to report my experience to local authorities, thinking maybe someone should know that something dangerous was in those woods. The state police were polite but clearly thought I'd either panicked over nothing or was making the whole thing up. The local historical society was more interested in adding my story to their collection of Dudley Town legends than in actually investigating. I showed them my phone, the photos of the carved symbols, the mysterious text message, my GPS track showing my panicked flight through the forest. They nodded and took notes and thanked me for sharing, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Just another person who went into Dudley Town looking for a thrill and scared themselves silly. Just another story for the collection. I still have the orange stickers I managed to recover. There are 42 of them in my pack, each one numbered on the back. I'd placed 67 stickers total during my hike, which means 25 are still out there somewhere, moved to positions I never intended, creating false trails for purposes I don't want to contemplate. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that cave. I think about what might have been waiting in there for me, if I'd followed the false trail all the way. I think about that text message, keep running, and wonder who sent it and how they knew what was happening. I think about the wailing and the sound of breathing, and the thing that stopped at the forest's edge as if crossing some invisible line. And I think about my explanation, the one I told myself when I was trying to rationalize everything. A hermit living in the woods. Someone with a whistle. A person, not a thing. A human being who, for whatever incomprehensible reason, had decided to hunt another human being through the forest. That explanation has holes you could drive a truck through. How could someone blow a whistle while running? Why would they stop at the forest edge? Who sent the text? Who carved those symbols and why? How had they known exactly where to move my markers to create a convincing false trail? But the alternative, admitting that something not human, something outside my understanding of the natural world exists in those woods, is somehow worse than any explanation involving human evil. Human evil I can comprehend, even if I can't understand it. The other thing, the thing my primitive brain insists was chasing me, is beyond comprehension. I still have nightmares. 2 or 3 times a week I wake up in the dark hearing that wailing sound, feeling branches tearing at my face, seeing my orange stickers at the wrong height on the trees. I dream about following the false trail all the way to that cave, about stepping into the darkness, about finally seeing what was waiting for me there. In those dreams I never wake up before I see it. In those dreams I always look, and what I see, I can't talk about what I see in those dreams. Not because I don't remember, but because I remember too well, and because putting it into words would make it too real, would make me sound completely insane. I'll probably never go back to Dudley Town Forest. I'll probably never know what really happened to me that day, never understand what lives in those silent woods or why it tried to lure me into that cave. Maybe that's for the best. Some mysteries I've come to realize are better left unsolved, but sometimes, usually late at night when sleep is far away, I pull up that text message on my phone. Keep running, it says. No context, no explanation. Just those 2 words from an unknown number. I stare at it and wonder who sent it and how they knew. I wonder if they're still out there somewhere, watching those woods, sending warnings to fools like me who don't know enough to stay away. And I wonder how many people didn't get the warning. How many people followed their false trails all the way to the end? How many people saw what was waiting in that cave? The forest is still there, of course. Still closed to the public, still full of old legends and dark stories. Still silent, still waiting. I imagine my 25 missing stickers are still out there too, placed at waist height on trees throughout the woods, creating a false trail that leads to a cave entrance. Maybe they'll stay there forever, slowly fading in the sun and rain, eventually falling off to decompose on the forest floor. Or maybe someone else will find them. Maybe someone else will follow that trail, trusting those bright orange markers, believing they'll lead to safety. I hope not. God, I hope not. But I can't go back there to remove them. I can't warn anyone who might find them. I can't do anything except tell my story and hope that someone somewhere will read it and decide that Dudleytown Forest is one place they don't need to explore. Some forests are meant to remain unmarked. Some silences are meant to remain unbroken. And some trails, even ones marked with bright orange stickers, are meant never to be followed. I learned that lesson the hard way. I just hope I'm the only one who had to. This is my true account of the events that happened to me in 2015. I was 32 years old, working as a mechanic in the small town of Millfield, Oregon. What follows is exactly as I remember it, though sometimes I wish I could forget. My name is Horace Villalobos, and this happened to me in 2015. I was a pretty ordinary guy, working as a mechanic in a small town in Oregon. My life was mostly uneventful, which was how I liked it. I had my routine, work, a few beers with friends at the local bar, and then home to my dog Chester. I wasn't looking for excitement, and I sure wasn't expecting what came my way. The story starts on a Wednesday. I remember because my boss Leo always joked about it being hump day, trying to get us to push through to the weekend. That day was hot, unusually so for early October, and the garage was sweltering. The ancient ceiling fan did nothing but push the thick air around in lazy circles. We had a steady stream of customers, mostly regulars who trusted us with their cars. I was under an old Chevy, hands greasy, cursing at a stubborn bolt that seemed welded in place by years of neglect and Oregon rain, when the bell over the door chimed. The sound cut through the radio's static-filled country music, and Earl's muttered complaints about part suppliers. I slid out from under the car on the creeper, wiping my hands on a rag that had seen better decades. There was a guy standing there in the doorway, and something about him made the hair on my neck stand up. He was tall and gaunt, maybe 40, with hollow cheeks that suggested he hadn't been eating regularly. His eyes darted around the garage like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. He had on a faded black hoodie despite the heat, which should have been my first warning. But you see all kinds in this job. People who dress for comfort over common sense. People with something to hide. People just passing through town with their own stories. So I didn't think much of it at first. "Help you?" I asked, standing and stretching the kinks from my back. He looked around nervously before speaking, his voice rough like he hadn't used it much lately. "Yeah, my car's acting up, keeps stalling out on me." "All right, bring it in and we'll take a look," I said, nodding toward the garage entrance. He went out, and a minute later drove in a beat-up old station wagon that looked like it had survived the apocalypse. The thing was more rust than metal, with duct tape holding the rear window together, and a front bumper that hung at an odd angle. As he got out, I noticed a tattoo on his neck, a strange symbol I'd never seen before. It looked like a circle with twisted lines radiating outward, almost like a dark sun. Something about it made me uneasy. But tattoos are common enough, right? I got to work on his car, trying to diagnose the problem while he paced around the garage like a caged predator. He was jittery, constantly checking his phone and glancing toward the windows. My buddy Earl noticed too and shot me a questioning glance from across the shop. I just shrugged, but I kept one eye on the stranger while I worked. The guy's restlessness was contagious. Every few minutes he'd stop pacing and stare at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just curiosity. It was like he was studying me, memorizing my face for some purpose I couldn't fathom. After about an hour of detective work, I found the issue: a faulty fuel pump. Probably original to the car and long overdue for replacement. I wiped my hands and approached him where he stood smoking by the open bay door. "Found your problem," I said. "It's the fuel pump. We can fix it, but it'll take a couple hours." He looked irritated, crushing his cigarette under a worn boot heel. "How much?" I quoted him the price, expecting him to haggle or complain. Instead, he just nodded. "I'll wait," he muttered, settling into the plastic chair in the corner we kept for customers. Earl and I went back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The stranger, he'd introduced himself as Blake when I asked for a name for the work order, kept fidgeting. At one point, I caught him staring at me with a look I couldn't quite decipher. It was almost like he recognized me, but I knew we'd never met. His face wasn't one I'd forget. The afternoon dragged on with unusual slowness. Even the familiar sounds of the garage, the hiss of the pneumatic tools, the radio crackling between stations, Earl's occasional curse when something didn't cooperate, seemed muted and distant. Blake's presence cast a shadow over everything, though I couldn't explain why. By late afternoon, we had his car running again. The new fuel pump hummed quietly, and the engine had that smooth idle that comes with proper maintenance. I handed him the bill, and he paid in cash without counting it. Mostly 20s and 10s, the kind of crumpled bills that suggested they'd been carried in pockets for too long. As he was leaving, tucking the receipt into his wallet, he stopped at the door and looked back at me. The late afternoon sun streaming through the windows cast his face in harsh shadows, making his hollow cheeks even more pronounced. "Thanks," he said, then paused. His next words hit me like a physical blow. "You're Villalobos, right? Horace Villalobos?" I felt a chill run down my spine, despite the garage's stifling heat. "Yeah, that's me," I replied cautiously, straightening up. "Why?" He nodded slowly, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I knew your dad." That was a punch to the gut that left me breathless. My dad had disappeared when I was 12, leaving behind nothing but questions and a hole in our family that never healed. He just vanished one day, went to work at the lumber mill and never came home. The police investigation had gone nowhere. No body, no note, no explanation, just gone, like he'd stepped off the edge of the world. I stepped closer to Blake, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "What do you know about my dad?" Blake's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Ask around," he said cryptically, then turned and walked out into the fading daylight. I watched him drive away, his station wagon's engine running smooth as silk now, but my hands were shaking. 20 years of wondering, of trying not to think about the man who'd taught me to throw a baseball and change a tire, and suddenly this stranger appears with knowledge I'd given up hope of ever finding. That night I couldn't sleep. Chester, my loyal German shepherd, lay at my feet, sensing my unease. He kept lifting his head, ears pricked, as if he could hear the turmoil in my mind. I kept replaying the conversation with Blake, wondering what he knew and why he'd waited until he was walking out the door to drop that bombshell. The house felt too quiet, too empty. Every creak of the settling wood made me tense. Outside, the wind moved through the Douglas firs that surrounded my small property, creating sounds that seemed almost like whispers. I found myself thinking about my father, remembering the last morning I'd seen him, the way he'd ruffled my hair and promised to help me with my homework that evening, a promise he'd never get to keep. Blake's words echoed in my head. Ask around, but ask who, and about what. My father's disappearance had been the town's mystery for exactly 1 week 20 years ago. Then it had faded into the background noise of small-town life. People moved on. They had to. But now, lying in my childhood bedroom in the house my mother had left me when she passed 5 years ago, I realized I'd never really moved on. I just buried the questions so deep I'd forgotten they were there. As the hours crawled by and dawn approached, I made a decision. I was going to find out what Blake knew about my father, no matter where it led me. I had no idea that decision would drag me into a nightmare that would make my father's disappearance seem like the least of my worries. The morning light filtering through my curtains couldn't chase away the shadows that Blake's words had awakened. Something dark was stirring in Millfield, and I was about to discover that some mysteries are better left buried. The next day at the garage, I was distracted. Every customer who walked through the door made me look up hopefully, thinking it might be Blake returning with more answers. But he didn't show. Earl noticed my restlessness and finally cornered me during our lunch break. "What's eating you, Horace? You've been jumpy as a cat all morning." I told him about Blake and what he'd said about my dad. Earl, being the conspiracy theorist he was, leaned forward with interest, his sandwich forgotten. "That's weird, man. Real weird. You think this Blake character knows something about what happened to your old man?" "I don't know what to think," I admitted, but he seemed to know who I was. Called me by name. Earl rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "You know what we should do? We should go to the Rusty Nail tonight. Your dad used to hang out there, right? Maybe Rick remembers something." The Rusty Nail was a dive bar on the edge of town, the kind of place where the beer was cheap and the conversations were cheaper. My dad had spent more evenings there than my mother appreciated, nursing a beer and playing pool with whoever was around. It wasn't a lead exactly, but it was somewhere to start. That evening, Earl and I headed to the bar as the sun was setting behind the mountains. The Rusty Nail hadn't changed much since my dad's days. Same flickering neon sign, same wooden door scarred by years of opening and closing. Same smell of stale beer and cigarettes that hit you the moment you walked in. We sat at the bar and ordered beers from Rick, the bartender who'd been there since before I was born. Rick was a weathered man in his 60s, with gray hair and arms covered in faded tattoos from his Navy days. He'd seen every kind of trouble the human condition could produce, and very little surprised him anymore. "Hey, Rick," I said after we'd settled in. "You remember my dad, Joe Valalos?" Rick's face softened slightly. "Yeah, I remember Joe. Good man. Quiet, mostly. What's this about, Horace?" I explained the encounter with Blake, watching Rick's expression carefully. When I mentioned Blake's name, something flickered across the bartender's face. Recognition, maybe, or concern. "Blake, huh?" Rick said, his voice dropping. "That guy's bad news, Horace. Seen him around town lately, but he's trouble. As for your dad, well..." He paused, wiping the bar with a rag in slow, deliberate circles. "There's some things folks around here don't like to talk about." Earl leaned forward. "Like what?" Rick sighed, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. The bar was nearly empty, just us, an old-timer playing the lottery machine, and a couple in the corner booth who were too wrapped up in each other to pay attention to anyone else. "Joe got mixed up with some people before he disappeared," Rick said quietly. "Weird folks. Real secretive. They had meetings, called themselves some kind of religious group, but it didn't feel right, you know? Had this symbol they all wore." My blood went cold. "What kind of symbol?" Rick made a vague gesture with his hand. "Like a sun, but twisted. Dark looking. Made me uncomfortable just seeing it. The same symbol I'd seen tattooed on Blake's neck. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it was a picture I didn't like." "What happened to them?" I asked, my heart pounding. "They left town around the same time Joe vanished," Rick said. "Nobody's seen or heard from them since. Good riddance if you ask me. But Horace..." He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "If this Blake character is connected to them, you need to be careful. Real careful." Earl and I exchanged glances. This was getting deeper than I'd expected, and a lot more dangerous. "Do you remember anything else about this group?" I pressed. Rick thought for a moment, his brow furrowed. "They called themselves something fancy. The Order of something Dawn. Scarlet Dawn, maybe? They rented that old Henderson farm outside town for a while. Place has been empty for years, but there were lights out there at night sometimes. Strange lights." We finished our beers in relative silence, each lost in our own thoughts. When we left the bar, the night air felt colder than it should have for October, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Over the next few days, I couldn't focus on anything else. I started digging into old records at the library, looking for any mention of the Order of the Scarlet Dawn. It wasn't easy. Small-town newspapers don't keep the best archives, but I found bits and pieces. A brief mention in the police blotter about noise complaints at the Henderson farm. A letter to the editor from a concerned citizen about unusual activities on the outskirts of town. A classified ad seeking spiritual seekers ready for transformation. Nothing concrete, but enough to paint a picture of a group that had operated in the shadows. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, remembered them too. She was a thin woman in her 70s who'd worked at the library for 40 years and had a memory like a steel trap. "Oh yes, I remember that group," she said when I asked. "They came in sometimes, looking for books on unusual subjects, ancient religions, mysticism, things like that. Made me uncomfortable, the way they looked at people, like they were sizing you up for something." "Do you remember their leader?" "A man named Cyrus. Tall, thin, with these intense eyes. Spoke very softly, but when he talked, people listened. Had a way about him, like he could see right through you." She shuddered slightly. "I was glad when they left town. That evening, I was at home researching what I could find online about cults and missing persons, when Chester started barking furiously at the front door. His bark was different than usual. Urgent, almost frantic. I grabbed the wrench I kept by the door and looked through the peephole. Blake stood on my porch, looking even more haggard than before. His clothes were rumpled, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow him out of the darkness. I opened the door cautiously, keeping the wrench ready. "What do you want?" "I need to talk to you," Blake said, his voice tight with fear. "It's about your dad, about what really happened to him." Against my better judgment, I let him in. Chester continued to growl low in his throat, not taking his eyes off Blake as we sat at my kitchen table. The house felt smaller with Blake in it, as if his presence had somehow compressed the walls. "Your dad," Blake began, his hands shaking slightly. "He was involved with the Order. They took him, used him for one of their rituals. I managed to get out, but they're still out there, still looking for more people, more sacrifices." My blood ran cold. "Sacrifices? What do you mean?" Blake's eyes darted to the windows, as if expecting faces to appear in the glass. "They believe in this ancient power, something dark. They think sacrificing people gives them control over it, makes them stronger. Your dad, he was one of their victims. They killed him, Horace, and now that you're asking questions, they'll come for you too." The words hit me like a physical blow. 20 years of wondering, and now I knew. My father hadn't left us. He'd been murdered by a cult of fanatics who thought his death would give them power. "Why are you telling me this now?" I managed to ask. Blake looked desperate, haunted. "Because they're after me. I've been running for months, but they found me again, and now that you're digging into the past, they know you're a threat. We need to stop them, Horace. We need to finish what your father started." "What do you mean?" "What my father started. He was trying to expose them, to stop them. That's why they killed him. But he hid something first. Evidence that could bring them down. I know where it is." I stared at Blake, trying to process what he was telling me. Everything I thought I knew about my father's disappearance was wrong. He hadn't abandoned us. He died trying to protect people from monsters. "Where?" I asked. "The old Henderson farm. They're using it again, Horace. The Order of the Scarlet Dawn is back." As Blake's words sank in, I realized my quiet life in Millfield was over. My father's ghost had returned to claim me, and I was about to walk into the same darkness that had swallowed him 20 years ago. But I had to know the truth. I had to finish what he'd started, even if it killed me. The next few days passed in a haze of planning and dread. Blake and I met twice more, always in different locations, always watching for signs we were being followed. He told me more about the Order, how they recruited vulnerable people with promises of spiritual enlightenment, how they slowly isolated their members from the outside world, and how they used fear and manipulation to maintain control. "They target people who are lost," Blake explained during one of our clandestine meetings at a diner 20 miles outside town. "People who've lost someone they love. People who feel like failures. People who are looking for meaning. They offer hope, purpose, belonging. By the time you realize what they really are, it's too late." "How did you get out?" Blake's face darkened. "I saw what they did to your father. I was supposed to help with the ritual. But when I saw," he shuddered, "I couldn't do it. I ran that night, and never looked back. Been running ever since." According to Blake, the Order had returned to the Henderson farm 6 months ago. They were smaller now, maybe a dozen core members, but they were planning something big. A final ritual that would supposedly give their leader Cyrus permanent control over the dark forces they worshipped. "We have to stop them," Blake insisted. "If they succeed, they'll have the power to do whatever they want. Your father's death will have been for nothing." I wanted to go to the police, but Blake shook his head. "They won't believe us. No evidence, no bodies they can find. They'll think we're crazy. And besides," he lowered his voice, "Cyrus has people everywhere. The Order has been recruiting for 20 years. Some of them might be cops. So we planned to go to the farm ourselves, to find the evidence my father had supposedly hidden and stop whatever the Order was planning. It was insane, reckless, and probably suicidal. But I couldn't let my father's sacrifice be meaningless. We decided to approach the farm on Saturday night. Blake had been watching their patterns. They held their main gatherings on Saturday evenings when most of the town was settling in for the night, and fewer people would notice unusual activity. Saturday came too quickly. Earl offered to come with us, but I refused. This was about my father, my responsibility. I wouldn't drag my friend into danger. As darkness fell, Blake and I drove separately to a point about 2 miles from the Henderson farm. We parked our cars hidden in a grove of trees and continued on foot, armed with flashlights, my toolbox, and what little courage we could muster. The Henderson farm sat in a valley surrounded by dense woods. The main house was a 2-story colonial that had seen better decades, its white paint now gray with age and neglect. Several outbuildings dotted the property, a barn, a equipment shed, and what looked like a newer structure that hadn't been there in my father's time. We approached carefully, staying in the tree line. Lights were on in the main house, and I could see figures moving around inside. Cars were parked in what used to be the front yard. Maybe 8 or 10 of them, all dark-colored and unremarkable. There, Blake whispered, pointing to the barn. That's where they keep the evidence. Your father hid something in there before they caught him. We crept closer, using the shadows cast by the moon to conceal our movement. The barn was dark and appeared to be empty. Blake produced a set of lockpicks from his pocket, a skill from his days with the order, he explained, and within minutes we were inside. The barn smelled of age and decay. Hay bales were stacked along the walls, and old farm equipment rusted in the corners. But there were newer additions too. Symbols painted on the walls in what looked like dried blood. Strange geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Over here, Blake whispered, leading me to a section of the wooden floor that looked different from the rest. Help me move these boards. We pried up several floorboards, revealing a small cavity underneath. Inside was a metal box, about the size of a shoebox. Blake lifted it out carefully, his hands shaking. This is it, he said. This is what your father died protecting. Inside the box were photographs, dozens of them, showing the order's rituals in horrific detail. Pictures of altars stained with blood, of people bound and terrified, of Cyrus himself performing ceremonies that defied description. And there were documents too, lists of members, financial records, and a journal written in my father's handwriting. I opened the journal with trembling hands and read by flashlight. My father's words painted a picture of a good man who'd stumbled into something evil and tried to stop it. He'd infiltrated the order, gathered evidence, and planned to take it to the FBI. But they discovered his true purpose before he could escape. We have to get this to the authorities, I said. But Blake grabbed my arm. Listen, he whispered. From outside came the sound of chanting, low voices rising and falling in unison. Through the barn's dirty windows, I could see lights moving across the farmyard, torches or candles carried by robed figures. Are starting the ritual, Blake said, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. We need to go, now. But as we moved toward the barn door, it swung open. 3 figures in dark robes stood silhouetted against the night sky, their faces hidden by hoods. I couldn't see their features, but I could feel their malevolent presence like a physical weight. Blake, one of them said in a voice like grinding stone. You shouldn't have come back. Blake stepped protectively in front of me. Run, Horace. Take the box and run. But more robed figures appeared at the barn's other entrance. We were surrounded. Horace Villalobos, the lead figure, continued, pushing back his hood to reveal a gaunt face with burning eyes. This had to be Cyrus. He looked exactly as Mrs. Patterson had described him, but 20 years older and far more terrible. The son of Joseph. How fitting that you should join us on this most sacred night. What do you want? I managed to ask, clutching the metal box against my chest. Cyrus smiled, but it was the smile of a predator. Why? To complete what we started 20 years ago, of course. Your father interfered with our work, but his sacrifice wasn't wasted. His death gave us power, and now yours will give us even more. The other cultists began to close in. Blake pulled a knife from his jacket when he armed himself, and held it ready. I won't let you hurt him, Blake said. You won't be able to stop us, Cyrus replied. You're outnumbered, outmatched. Your little rebellion ends tonight. What happened next was chaos. Blake lunged at the nearest cultist, his knife flashing in the dim light. I ran for the side wall of the barn, hoping to break through the old wood, but more robed figures poured in from outside. A hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. I swung my flashlight like a club, connecting with someone's head. The impact sent vibrations up my arm, and my attacker staggered backward. The box, Blake shouted. Don't let them have the box. I held onto it desperately as hands reached for me from all directions. In the confusion, I saw Blake struggling with two cultists, his knife red with blood. Then something hard hit me in the back of the head, and the world exploded into stars. When the ringing in my ears cleared, I was on my knees in the farmyard, surrounded by the entire order. They'd formed a circle around Blake and me, their torches casting dancing shadows on the ground. At the center of the circle stood Cyrus, now wearing elaborate robes covered in the same twisted sun symbol I'd seen on Blake's neck. 20 years, Cyrus said, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. 20 years since Joseph Villalobos tried to stop us. 20 years since his death gave us the power to grow, to spread our influence, to prepare for this moment. The metal box lay at his feet, its contents scattered in the dirt. All of my father's work, all the evidence he'd died to preserve, was now in the hands of the very people he'd tried to stop. But tonight, Cyrus continued, we complete the cycle. Tonight we sacrifice the son, as we sacrifice the father, and the power we gain will be enough to open the final door. I looked around desperately, searching for any means of escape. But the cultists stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces hidden by hoods, their attention focused entirely on Cyrus and his terrible promises. Blake caught my eye and mouthed a single word, run. Then he threw himself at Cyrus, tackling the cult leader to the ground. The circle broke as cultists rushed to help their leader, and in the confusion, I saw my chance. I ran into the darkness, branches whipping at my face as I crashed through the woods. Behind me, I could hear shouting, the sound of pursuit. But I knew these woods better than they did. I'd hunted here as a boy with my father, before everything went wrong. I made it to my car and drove away as fast as I dared, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. In my rearview mirror, I could see the glow of the torches at the Henderson farm, like a wound in the night sky. Blake had saved my life, but I'd left him to die with those monsters. And somewhere in those dark woods, the Order of the Scarlet Dawn was still conducting their terrible rituals, still planning whatever apocalyptic finale Cyrus had in mind. My father's ghost wasn't finished with me yet. The nightmare was just beginning. I drove aimlessly for hours, my mind reeling from what I'd witnessed. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror made me think I was being followed. Every shadow seemed to hide robed figures waiting to drag me back to that farmyard of horrors. Eventually, I found myself parked outside the police station in town. I sat there for nearly an hour, clutching the steering wheel, trying to decide what to do. Blake had been right. Who would believe this story? A cult, ritual sacrifice, ancient powers? I'd sound like a madman, but I had to try. Chief Morrison had been a friend of my father's, and he listened patiently as I told him everything. His expression grew more skeptical with each detail, but he took notes and asked questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me with tired eyes. Horace, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. You're not the type to make up stories. But what you're telling me, he shook his head. It sounds like something out of a horror movie. I know how it sounds, Chief, but you can check the Henderson farm. There's evidence there, ritual sites, probably Blake's body by now. Morrison sighed. All right, I'll send a couple of officers out there in the morning. But Horace, if this is some kind of prank, or if you're having some kind of breakdown, it's not, I said firmly. My father was murdered by these people, and they tried to kill me tonight. The chief promised to investigate, but I could see in his eyes that he thought I was losing my grip on reality. I left the station feeling more alone than ever. I spent what remained of the night at a motel on the other side of town, too paranoid to go home. Chester whined and paced in the small room, sensing my distress. Neither of us slept much. The next morning, Chief Morrison called with news that chilled me to the bone. We checked the Henderson farm, Horace. It's empty. Has been for months by the look of it. No signs of recent activity, no evidence of any gathering last night. Nothing. That's impossible. I was there. I saw them. I believe you think you saw them, Morrison said gently. But son, there's nothing there. Maybe you should talk to someone. Get some help dealing with your father's disappearance. It's never too late to process grief. They thought I was crazy. The order had cleaned up their traces, probably moved to another location, and now I looked like a man who'd invented an elaborate delusion to cope with childhood trauma. But they'd made one mistake. They'd left Blake alive. I found him that afternoon, beaten and bloody, hiding in an abandoned storage unit on the outskirts of town. He was barely conscious when I discovered him, and it took several minutes to convince him I wasn't another cultist coming to finish the job. "They're gone," he whispered through split lips. "Pulled up stakes and left before dawn. But they'll be back, Horace. They're not finished with us." I helped him to my car and drove him to a clinic in the next town over, where a tired doctor stitched his wounds without asking too many questions. Blake had taken a severe beating, but he was alive. "Why didn't they kill you?" I asked as we sat in the clinic's parking lot afterward. "They tried, but something interrupted them. Car coming down the road maybe. Or they heard sirens in the distance. Had to scatter fast, left me for dead." He touched his bandaged face gingerly. "Joke's on them. I'm harder to kill than I look." Over the next few days, Blake recovered enough to tell me what he'd learned during his captivity. The Order hadn't given up. They'd simply moved their operation to a backup location, and their final ritual was still planned for the coming weekend, on the night of the new moon. "There's something else," Blake said, his voice heavy with dread. "Cyrus knows about your mother." My blood turned to ice. "What about my mother?" "She didn't die of cancer, Horace. They poisoned her. Slowly, over months, making it look like a natural illness. It was revenge for what your father did, and a way to isolate you, make you vulnerable. The world seemed to tilt sideways. My mother, who'd raised me alone after my father disappeared, who'd fought so bravely against what we thought was cancer, had actually been murdered. Murdered by the same monsters who'd killed my father. Where are they now?" I asked, my voice barely controlled. "There's an old mine shaft about 30 miles north of here. Abandoned silver mine from the 1800s. They've been preparing the site for weeks, carving symbols into the rock, setting up their altar. Saturday night they're going to try to open what they call the Scarlet Door." "What's the Scarlet Door?" Blake's face was pale. "According to their beliefs, it's a passage to the realm of their dark god. If they succeed in opening it, they'll have power beyond imagination. And the first thing they'll do is come after everyone who opposed them. You, me, anyone who knows their secrets." I thought about Chief Morrison, who'd dismissed my story. About Earl, who'd wanted to help. About Mrs. Patterson at the library, who'd given me information about the Order. They were all in danger because of me. "We have to stop them," I said. "There are only 2 of us, and at least a dozen of them. Plus whatever Cyrus might summon if the ritual actually works. Then we make sure it doesn't work." Blake studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but we do this smart. We don't try to be heroes. We sabotage their ritual and get out alive. Deal?" "Deal." We spent the rest of the week planning. Blake knew their routines, their security measures, their weaknesses. The mine was in a remote area with only one access road, which would make escape difficult but also meant they wouldn't have lookouts posted far from the site. Saturday arrived gray and overcast, with heavy clouds that promised rain. As evening approached, Blake and I drove to within a mile of the mine, then hiked through the forest to reach the entrance. The old mine shaft had been transformed into something from a nightmare. Torches lined the entrance, and carved symbols covered every available surface. The twisted sun symbol of the Order was repeated hundreds of times, etched into the rock with obsessive precision. We could hear chanting echoing from deep within the mine. The same rhythmic voices I'd heard at the farm, but louder now, more urgent. The ritual had begun. "The altar will be at the bottom of the main shaft," Blake whispered. "That's where they'll try to open the door. If we can disrupt the ceremony, cause enough chaos, maybe we can stop them." We crept into the mine, following the sound of voices deeper into the earth. The air grew colder as we descended, and our flashlights revealed more symbols carved into the walls, some of them seeming to pulse with their own malevolent life. The main chamber opened before us like a vision of hell. The Order had assembled around a stone altar that looked ancient beyond measure. Cyrus stood at its center, his arms raised toward a section of the cavern wall where the symbols were carved deepest. The wall itself seemed to be shifting, as if reality was becoming fluid, but what froze my blood was the figure bound to the altar. It was Earl. My friend lay unconscious on the stone slab, his wrists and ankles secured with rope. He must have come looking for me when I didn't show up for work, and somehow the Order had captured him. They need a sacrifice to complete the ritual. Blake breathed in my ear. Someone connected to you, to your father's bloodline. Cyrus raised a curved knife above Earl's chest, and I saw the scarlet door beginning to form in the wall, a crack in reality itself, through which something vast and terrible was trying to push through. I couldn't let Earl die. I couldn't let these monsters succeed. I grabbed a loose rock and hurled it at Cyrus, shouting at the top of my lungs. The stone struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending the knife clattering across the cavern floor. Chaos erupted. The cultists turned toward us, their chanting broken, and the forming door in the wall began to waver and fade. Blake and I fought our way toward the altar, desperate to reach Earl before the order could regroup. But Cyrus was faster than I'd expected. Even wounded, he moved with inhuman speed, snatching up the fallen knife and turning back toward Earl. "You're too late," he screamed. "The door is already opening. Your friend's death will complete what your father tried to stop." The knife plunged downward toward Earl's chest, but I tackled Cyrus at the last second, sending us both crashing to the cavern floor. We wrestled for the weapon, rolling across the uneven stone as cultists tried to reach us. Blake was fighting desperately against three robed figures, his face streaming blood from a fresh wound. Earl was stirring on the altar, beginning to regain consciousness but still bound and helpless. I managed to get my hands on the knife, driving it upward into Cyrus's chest. His eyes went wide with shock and pain, but also with something like triumph. "It doesn't matter," he gasped. "The door is already open." He collapsed, but his words proved true. The crack in the cavern wall had stabilized, and through it I could see something that defied description. A realm of endless darkness where things that had never been human moved with malevolent intelligence. The surviving cultists fell to their knees, some weeping, others laughing with mad joy. Their leader was dead, but his final ritual had succeeded. Something began to push through the scarlet door, a tendril of living shadow that reached into our world with hungry intent. Where it touched the cavern walls, the stone withered and cracked. "We have to get out of here," Blake shouted, cutting Earl's bonds with swift strokes of his knife. "The whole place is going to collapse." Earl was weak but mobile, and the three of us ran for the mine entrance as the cavern began to shake apart behind us. The thing from beyond the door was still emerging, its alien presence too much for our reality to contain. We burst out of the mine just as the entrance collapsed in a roar of falling stone. But I could still feel the presence of the thing we'd released, spreading outward like an infection, seeking new ways to enter our world. Blake looked at the sealed mine shaft, then at me. "It's not over, is it?" "No," I said, thinking of the shadow I'd seen reaching through the door, and the way the cultists had smiled even as their leader died. "I don't think it ever will be." 6 months have passed since that night at the mine, and I wish I could say everything returned to normal. But nothing about my life has been normal since Blake first walked into the garage with his cryptic knowledge about my father. The official story was simple enough. An old mine shaft had collapsed due to structural instability, probably triggered by recent rains. Chief Morrison mentioned it briefly in the local paper, noting that the site had been marked as dangerous and would be permanently sealed. No mention of cults or rituals or things that shouldn't exist. Blake disappeared 3 days after our escape from the mine. I came home from work to find a note on my kitchen table. "They're still out there, and they know we stopped the ritual. I'm going underground for a while. Watch yourself, Horace. This isn't finished." He was right, of course. The Order of the Scarlet Dawn might have lost their leader, but their surviving members had scattered rather than disbanded. And something had come through that door in the mine. Something that hadn't died when the tunnel collapsed. I started seeing the signs almost immediately. Animals in the area began acting strangely, either becoming aggressive or simply disappearing. Plants near the sealed mine entrance withered and died despite the spring rains. And sometimes, late at night, I could feel something watching me from the darkness beyond my windows. Earl recovered from his ordeal physically, but the experience had marked him. He'd seen things in that cavern that he couldn't explain or forget. We didn't talk much about that night. What was there to say? We'd witnessed something beyond human understanding, and we were both struggling to live with that knowledge. "You ever think about leaving town?" Earl asked me one day while we were working on a transmission rebuild. "Every day," I admitted. "But where would I go? And what about Chester?" This is his home too. Chester had become increasingly protective since the night at the mine. He slept across my bedroom doorway now, positioning himself between me and any potential threat. Dogs sense things humans miss, and Chester clearly sensed that our troubles weren't over. The first clear sign that Blake had been right came about a month after the mine collapse. I was closing up the garage late one evening when I noticed a man standing across the street, just outside the pool of light cast by the street lamp. He was wearing a dark coat and hat, and something about his posture seemed familiar. When I looked again, he was gone. It happened several more times over the following weeks. Glimpses of figures watching me from a distance, always disappearing when I tried to get a better look. Someone was keeping tabs on me, and I had a pretty good idea who. The remaining cultists hadn't forgotten that Earl and I had destroyed their leader and disrupted their ritual. We were unfinished business, loose ends that needed to be tied up. I bought a gun, a .38 revolver that I kept in the drawer of my bedside table. I'd never owned a firearm before, but the events at the mine had convinced me that there were worse things in the world than bullets could handle. But bullets were still better than nothing. The harassment escalated gradually. My mail was tampered with. My truck's tires were slashed twice. Someone broke into the garage one night, but didn't steal anything. They just rearranged tools and left symbols carved into my workbench. The same twisted sun that had marked the order, but smaller now, more subtle. A reminder that they were still out there. Chief Morrison took my complaints seriously this time. The mine collapse had left him more open to the possibility that dangerous people were operating in the area, even if he didn't accept my explanation of what we'd really faced that night. "I've got patrol cars driving by your place more often," he told me during one of our meetings, "and I've reached out to the FBI about possible cult activity in the region. Whatever's happening, Horace, we're not going to let them intimidate you." But the federal agents who came to interview me were skeptical of my story, especially the parts about ritual sacrifice and supernatural phenomena. They took notes, promised to investigate, and left town after 2 days with nothing to show for their efforts. The real turning point came on a rainy night in October, almost exactly a year after Blake had first appeared in my garage. I was home alone, reading in my living room while Chester dozed at my feet, when the lights went out. Power outages weren't uncommon during autumn storms, but this felt different. The darkness outside my windows was too complete, too absolute. Even the streetlights were dead, and I couldn't see any lights from neighboring houses. Chester lifted his head, growling low in his throat. His hackles were raised, and he was staring at the front door with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight and the .48, moving carefully toward the window to look outside. What I saw made me understand that my reprieve was over. They were standing in my yard, 5 figures in dark clothing, arranged in a rough circle around my house. I couldn't make out their faces, but I didn't need to. The way they stood, perfectly still and patient, told me everything I needed to know. The surviving members of the order had come to finish what Cyrus had started. My phone was dead. No dial tone, no cell service. They'd cut the lines and probably had some kind of signal jammer. I was on my own. I considered my options. The house had 2 exits. The front door and the back door leading to the kitchen. Both were probably being watched. The windows were possibilities, but they'd see me coming and be ready. Chester suddenly barked once, sharply, then fell silent. He was looking toward the kitchen now, his body tense with alertness. Someone was trying to get in through the back door. I moved through the house as quietly as possible, the Jiku ready in my hand. Through the kitchen window I could see a dark figure working at the door lock with practiced efficiency. They'd be inside within minutes. That's when I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of waiting for them to come to me, I went to them. I threw open the front door and charged outside, shouting at the top of my lungs. The sudden noise and movement caught them off guard. They'd expected me to cower inside, waiting to be taken. The figure at the back door spun around, startled by my appearance. I put 2 bullets in his chest before he could react, and he dropped without a sound. The others were closing in now, moving with deadly purpose. I ran for my truck, parked in the driveway, but another cultist stepped into my path. This one was a woman, middle-aged, with the same fanatic intensity I remembered from the mine. "You can't run forever, Villalobos," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos. We'll find you wherever you go. Maybe, I replied, raising the gun. But you won't. She lunged at me with a knife, but I was ready. The .38 spoke again, and she went down hard. 3 more cultists were converging on my position. I made it to the truck and got the engine started, but they reached me before I could pull away. Hands grabbed at the door handle, trying to drag me out of the cab. I floored the accelerator, and the truck lurched forward. One of the cultists was caught by the rear bumper and went down screaming. The other 2 were thrown clear as I spun the wheel hard to the right. In my rearview mirror, I could see them picking themselves up, their dark forms illuminated by my taillights. But I was moving now, putting distance between myself and the house where I'd lived my entire adult life. I drove through the night, stopping only for gas and to check that I wasn't being followed. By dawn, I was 3 states away, trying to figure out what to do next. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've been living like Blake, staying mobile, never remaining in one place long enough for them to track me down. Chester adapted to life on the road better than I expected, though I can see the stress wearing on him. He's getting older, and this constant vigilance is taking its toll. I've had contact with other survivors, people who've encountered cults like the Order, or who've witnessed things that shouldn't exist. There's an informal network of us now, sharing information and warnings through encrypted channels and coded messages. The thing that came through the Scarlet Door is still out there. I've seen reports from across the country, areas where reality seems unstable, where people disappear or change in inexplicable ways. The influence is spreading, slowly but steadily, and I don't think conventional authorities are equipped to deal with it. Blake surfaces occasionally, always in different places, always with new information about the Order's activities. They're rebuilding, recruiting new members, planning something bigger than what we stopped at the mine, and they haven't forgotten about us. The door we closed was just the beginning. Blake told me during our last meeting, in a diner outside Denver. There are others, dozens of them, maybe more, and every time they succeed in opening one, it gets easier to open the next. So I keep moving, keep watching, keep fighting when I have to. My father died trying to stop these monsters, and my mother was murdered for his interference. I won't let their deaths be meaningless. Sometimes, late at night in whatever motel room or safe house I'm occupying, I think about my old life in Millfield. The garage, the routine, the simple pleasure of fixing things that were broken. It seems like something from another person's life now, a dream of normalcy that was never really mine to keep. But then I remember Earl, tied to that stone altar, moments away from death. I remember the thing pushing through the Scarlet Door, bringing its alien hunger into our world. I remember my father's journal, his desperate attempt to preserve evidence of the Order's crimes. Some fights choose you, whether you want them or not. This one chose my family 20 years ago, and it's not finished with us yet. I'm writing this account in a truck stop in Nebraska, with Chester sleeping in the passenger seat and one eye on the door. Tomorrow we'll move on to the next town, the next lead, the next battle in a war that most people don't even know is being fought. The Order of the Scarlet Dawn thinks they can outlast me, that eventually I'll make a mistake or grow tired of running. They might be right, but until that day comes, I'll keep fighting, keep exposing their activities, keep preventing them from opening their doors to whatever hell they worship. It's what my father would have wanted. It's what my mother would have expected. And it's the only way I know to honor their memory while protecting the innocent people who have no idea what's lurking in the shadows of their quiet lives. The road stretches ahead, empty and dark. But I'm not afraid of the darkness anymore. I've seen what lives in it, and I know how to fight back. Chester stirs in his sleep, probably dreaming of the home we can never return to. I start the engine and pull back onto the highway, heading toward whatever comes next. The nightmare isn't over, but neither am I. My grandfather always said the mountains remember everything, every footstep, every breath, every death. Standing at the edge of Cataloochee Valley as dawn broke over the Great Smoky Mountains, I understood what he meant. The mist rising from the hollers carried whispers that only someone with Cherokee blood could truly hear. My name is Wohali Amadahe, and like my ancestors before me, I am a guardian of these ancient woods. Not the kind of guardian the old stories speak of, the ones who could speak to animals and shapeshift under the moon. But a modern one, a park ranger for the National Park Service, carrying a radio instead of a war club, wearing government-issued khaki instead of traditional dress. Still, the responsibility feels the same. These mountains are in my blood, passed down through my mother's line from the Wolf Clan, and I protect them with everything I have. That October morning started like any other. I'd been patrolling the backcountry trails for 6 years, ever since I'd returned home from college with a degree in forestry and a head full of scientific explanations for things my grandmother swore were magic. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 4 years learning to measure trees and catalog species, only to come back to a place where the trees themselves were my teachers. The radio crackled to life as I checked the overnight weather station readings. "Wohali, you copy?" "Copy. Dispatch. What have you got?" "Missing persons report came in about 20 minutes ago. Family of 4 didn't return from yesterday's day hike on the Rough Fork Trail. Vehicles still in the parking area. You're closest to that sector." I felt my stomach tighten. Missing persons cases were the worst part of the job. In these mountains you could step off a trail and disappear forever. The terrain was unforgiving. Steep ravines, hidden caves, and dense rhododendron thickets that could swallow a person whole. And then there were the other things, the ones we didn't put in the official reports. "Copy that. Edith, 20 minutes to the trailhead. Can you give me details on the missing party?" "The Hendersons from Atlanta. Parents Mark and Linda. Kids Jessica and Tommy, ages 10 and 7. Last seen yesterday around 3 p.m. starting the Rough Fork Trail loop. Supposed to be back by 6 p.m. My chest constricted. Kids. It was always harder when kids were involved. I reached the Rough Fork trailhead as the morning sun began burning off the mist. The Hendersons' red SUV sat alone in the gravel lot, a child's forgotten sweater visible through the rear window. I checked my gear, emergency medical kit, water, rope, GPS unit, and my grandfather's traditional hunting knife that I carried for reasons I couldn't entirely explain to my supervisors. The trail started easy enough, following an old logging road through second-growth forest. But I knew where it led, deep into one of the most remote sections of the park, where the tourist maps marked areas as primitive wilderness, and the ranger maps had notations in red ink, warning of unstable terrain and seasonal trail closures. About a mile in, I found their first sign, a granola bar wrapper caught on a blackberry bush, just off the main trail. Then, 50 yards further, tiny sneaker prints in the mud beside a creek crossing. They'd definitely come this way, but something was wrong. The prints showed they'd left the marked trail. I keyed my radio. "Dispatch, I've got sign of the missing party about a mile up Rough Fork Trail. Looks like they went off trail near marker 12. Continuing pursuit." "Copy, Wohali. SAR team is mobilizing but won't reach you for at least an hour. Keep us posted." Following the tracks led me into territory I knew well but rarely ventured into alone. This was the deep forest where the Cherokee had once hunted and held ceremonies, where my grandmother said the spirits still walked. The trees here were old, massive tulip poplars and hemlocks that had somehow escaped the loggers' saws a century ago. Their canopy was so thick that even at midday it felt like twilight. The family's trail was easy to follow at first. Broken twigs, disturbed leaves, the occasional piece of litter that made my ranger's heart cringe. But after about a half mile, something changed. The signs became scattered, confused. It looked like they'd started running. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling call echoing through the trees. Not quite a howl, not quite a roar, but something in between. Something that made every instinct inherited from my hunting ancestors scream danger. I'd heard every animal sound these mountains could produce. Black bear, coyote, even the occasional elk that wandered down from Virginia. This was none of those. I froze, listening. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no insect buzz, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Even the wind had stilled. In Cherokee tradition, we call this Ganol Vizgi, the silence that comes when the spirits are walking. The call came again, closer this time, and I caught something that made my blood run cold. Underneath that inhuman sound was something else, a child's voice, high and terrified, crying for help. I broke into a run, crashing through laurel thickets and leaping fallen logs, following the sound. My radio bounced against my hip, but I didn't dare stop to call for backup. Those kids needed help now. The terrain grew rougher, ascending toward a ridge I'd only explored once before during my first year as a ranger. According to the geological surveys, there were several small caves and rock shelters in that area, places where a family might take shelter, or where something else might take them. I paused at the base of a massive oak tree to catch my breath and check my GPS. The signal was weak this deep in the mountains, but I could see I was still roughly following Rough Fork, which meant I was heading toward Cataloochee Divide. That's when I saw the footprint. It was pressed deep into the soft earth beside a seasonal stream filled with muddy water from the previous night's rain. But it wasn't a human footprint. It was easily twice the size of my own boot, with what looked like 5 distinct toe impressions. The depth suggested something incredibly heavy, and the stride length, based on the next print I found 20 feet away, indicated something with legs much longer than any human. My grandmother had told me stories when I was young, stories about the Kekla Kudla, the hair-covered giant who lived in the deepest parts of the forest. I dismissed them as folklore, the kind of tales every culture tells about the wilderness beyond their villages. But staring at that impossible footprint, I felt the weight of generations of Cherokee wisdom pressing down on me. The child's cry came again, definitely closer now, and I forced myself to move. Folklore or not, there were real people in danger somewhere ahead of me. I climbed the ridge, using game trails and following what appeared to be a path of disturbed vegetation. The massive footprints appeared regularly now, always heading in the same direction, toward a series of limestone bluffs I could see through the trees ahead. As I approached the bluffs, I caught a scent that made me gag. A mixture of wet fur, decay, and something else, something musky and wild that I couldn't identify. It was the smell of something that had never been civilized, never been tamed. That's when I saw them. The Henderson family was huddled together in a shallow cave beneath one of the bluffs, the parents shielding their children with their bodies. They were alive but terrified, clothes torn and dirty, Linda Henderson clutching a makeshift bandage around her husband's arm. But they weren't alone. Standing at the mouth of the cave, its back to me, was something that challenged every rational thought I'd ever had. It stood at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair that seemed to ripple in the breeze. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, and its arms hung down past where its knees should be. Even from behind, I could see the raw power in its frame, muscles moving beneath the fur like steel cables. The creature, and I knew now, that's what it was. Despite everything my education told me about the impossibility, was making low, rumbling sounds. Not threatening exactly, but not reassuring either. It reminded me of the sounds my grandmother used to make when she was trying to calm a frightened animal. Little Tommy Henderson was the first to see me. His eyes went wide over his mother's shoulder, and he started to point. I pressed my finger to my lips, hoping he'd understand the need for quiet. But the creature heard him anyway. It turned slowly, and for the first time in my life, I looked into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist. They were dark, almost black, but undeniably intelligent. There was something ancient in that gaze, something that reminded me of my grandfather's eyes when he spoke about the old ways. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, could taste copper fear in my mouth. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't leave the family. The creature took a step toward me, and I saw its face clearly for the first time. It was definitely humanoid, but wilder, more primitive. Its features were heavy and pronounced, covered in the same dark fur as the rest of its body. But the eyes held an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. I remembered something my grandmother once told me. When you meet something in the forest that you don't understand, show respect. The old spirits remember the time when all beings spoke the same language. Moving slowly, I took off my ranger hat and placed it over my heart, the way my grandfather had taught me to show respect to elders. I spoke in Cherokee, words my grandmother had made me memorize, even though I didn't always understand their deeper meaning. Usio, e dohi et silviquodi. Hello, cousin. We come in peace. The creature's massive head tilted slightly, and I could have sworn I saw something like recognition in those dark eyes. It made a sound lower, softer than before, that almost sounded like a response. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it melted back into the forest. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. leaving only the scent of wild fir and the sound of branches settling back into place. I rushed to the Henderson family, who were staring at me like I'd just performed a miracle. "Everyone okay? Anyone seriously hurt?" Mark Henderson tried to stand but winced and stayed seated. "My arm, I think it's broken. But that thing, it didn't hurt us. It's been watching us since yesterday evening. Like it was protecting us from something." "Protecting you?" Linda Henderson nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We got lost, took a wrong turn somewhere. When it got dark, we heard things in the forest, scary things. But whenever those sounds got close, that our creature would make noise, and they'd go away." Young Jessica spoke up in a whisper. "The fuzzy man brought us water and berries." I looked around the cave and saw they were right. Something had brought them food and water. There were fresh mountain laurel leaves arranged like cups, still damp with spring water, and a pile of late-season blackberries. As I radioed for the SR team and medical evacuation, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just experienced something beyond the normal world. The Henderson family had been lost in one of the most dangerous parts of the park, in an area where people had disappeared permanently before. But instead of becoming victims, they'd been protected by something that my rational mind insisted couldn't exist. The evacuation went smoothly. The SAR team arrived within the hour, and we had the family back to civilization by late afternoon. Mark Henderson's arm was indeed broken, but otherwise they were all in remarkably good condition for having spent a night exposed in the wilderness. That evening I sat on my grandmother's porch, watching the sun set over the mountains she'd known all her life. I told her about what had happened, expecting her to either dismiss it as stress-induced hallucination or lecture me about respecting the old spirits. Instead, she just nodded. "The Kekla has been watching over our people for longer than the white man has been on this continent," she said quietly. "Your grandfather saw one once, during the hard winter of 1962. It led him to shelter when he was lost in a blizzard." "But grandmother, it doesn't make scientific sense. There's no evidence of any large primate species in North America outside of human beings." She smiled and patted my hand with fingers gnarled by arthritis but still strong. "Science is just one way of understanding the world, Udoda. Our people have other ways, older ways. Just because something can't be measured doesn't mean it isn't real." That night, I lay awake thinking about intelligent eyes in a face covered with fur, about the respectful way the creature had stepped back when I spoke Cherokee, about a family that should have died in the wilderness but was saved by something that officially doesn't exist. Outside my window, the mountains held their secrets close, as they always had. But now I knew I was sharing those secrets with something ancient and powerful, something that had been here long before my people arrived, and would be here long after we were gone. I had no idea that my encounter with the Kekla was just the beginning. 3 weeks passed before the second disappearance. 3 weeks of routine patrols, filing reports that carefully omitted certain details, and trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced in that limestone cave had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. The scientific part of my mind, the part trained in forestry and wildlife management, worked overtime to rationalize what had happened. But late at night, when the mountain wind whispered through the pines outside my cabin, I remembered those ancient eyes, and I knew, in the part of me that carried my grandmother's blood and my grandfather's stories, that every word of my report had been true. The call came at 4:30 a.m. on a Tuesday in early November. "Wahali, we've got another missing persons case. This one's different." I was already reaching for my uniform as dispatch continued the briefing. Something in her voice, Sarah had been working dispatch for 15 years, told me this wasn't a routine lost hiker situation. How different. 2 missing parties, separate groups, both experienced hikers. The Martineau couple from Tennessee disappeared somewhere on the Appalachian Trail section through Clingman's Dome. The second group, 3 college students from UNC, was doing a backcountry camping trip near Forney Ridge. Both parties missed their check-in times yesterday. I felt ice settle in my stomach. 2 missing groups in one day was almost unheard of, especially this late in the season when most casual hikers had given up on the mountains until spring. When were they last seen? The Martinos checked in at the Forney Ridge Trail Junction Sunday afternoon. The college kids Rebecca Chen, David Martinez, and Alex Thompson filed their backcountry permit for a 3-day trip starting Monday. Their friends expected them to return to campus yesterday evening. I was already mentally mapping the areas. Klingman's Dome and Forney Ridge weren't far apart, maybe 10 miles of rough mountain terrain. Both areas were in the deep backcountry, where cell service was non-existent, and the nearest road could be a day's hike away. I'll start with the Martineau Trail. They've been missing longer. Wahali. Sarah's voice dropped. There's something else. We got 3 separate reports from campers in that area yesterday evening. All of them reported hearing strange sounds in the forest. Calling sounds, like someone in distress, but not quite right. The ice in my stomach crystallized. I remembered my grandmother's stories about the Nviaya, the spirits that could mimic human voices to lure people into the deep forest. Stories I'd dismissed as folklore until 3 weeks ago. What kind of sounds? Best description we got was from a couple camping at Elkmont. They said it sounded like someone calling for help, but the voice kept changing. Sometimes it was a man, sometimes a woman, sometimes... I finished dressing in the dark, my hands moving automatically to check my gear. Standard rescue equipment, plus the things I'd started carrying since my encounter with the Henderson family. My grandfather's bone-handled knife, a pouch of traditional tobacco for offerings, and a small piece of mica my grandmother had pressed into my palm the night I'd told her about the Kekla-Kudla. The voice kept changing, she'd said, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The drive to Klingman's Dome took 45 minutes on winding mountain roads shrouded in pre-dawn mist. By the time I reached the parking area, the sun was a pale disk struggling through low clouds. The Appalachian Trail stretched away into gray wilderness, ancient and patient. The Martineau's car was a newer Honda, Tennessee plates, with 2 expensive mountain bikes locked to a rear rack. I cupped my hands and peered through the windows. Everything looked normal. Water bottles, energy bars, a dog-eared trail guide open to the Smoky Mountains section. I started up the trail at a steady pace, following the white blazes that marked the most famous footpath in America. This section of the AT was rugged but well-maintained, passing through high-elevation forests of spruce and fir that reminded me more of Canada than the southeastern United States. The first sign came 2 miles in. Paul Martineau's hiking pole, expensive carbon fiber, lying beside the trail near a scenic overlook. I picked it up and examined it carefully. No damage, no blood. It looked like it had simply been dropped. I keyed my radio. Dispatch. I've got evidence of the missing hikers at approximately mile marker 2 on the AT south from Klingman's Dome. Continuing search. Copy, Wahali. Say our teams are mobilizing but won't reach your location for at least 2 hours due to the remote access. 2 hours. In these mountains, 2 hours could mean the difference between finding someone alive or finding them too late. I pressed on, now following more than just the official trail. There were subtle signs, a scuff mark on a rock, a broken twig pointing the wrong direction, that suggested the Martineaus had left the marked path somewhere near the overlook. The forest grew thicker as I descended from the main ridge, following what appeared to be an old game trail through rhododendron thickets and around moss-covered boulders. This was true wilderness, the kind of place where a person could disappear without a trace. That's when I started hearing the voices. At first, I thought it was wind in the trees, or maybe the distant sound of other searchers. But as I stopped to listen, the sounds became more distinct. Someone was calling for help, a woman's voice echoing through the forest ahead of me. "Help! Please, someone help us!" I broke into a jog, crashing through undergrowth and leaping fallen logs. The voice continued, always seeming to come from just ahead, just around the next bend or over the next rise. But there was something wrong with it. The cadence was off, like someone reading from a script rather than genuine distress. And worse, the voice was too clear. Sound didn't carry that cleanly through dense forest, especially with the dampening effect of the morning mist. I slowed my pace and approached more carefully, every sense on high alert. My grandmother's warnings echoed in my memory. Never follow a voice you can't see, Ujidota. The forest spirits are clever, but they can't always get the details right. The calling continued, now coming from a dense grove of mountain laurel ahead. But as I got closer, I noticed that the birds had gone silent, just like 3 weeks ago, just like when the Kekla-Kudla had appeared. I drew my grandfather's knife, not from any belief that a blade could harm a spirit, but because holding it connected me to generations of Cherokee who had walked these mountains and faced their mysteries. The voice changed. Wahali, Wahali, help me. Now it was a man's voice, and it knew my name. I stopped dead. No one else was supposed to be in this area. The SR teams were still hours away, and I hadn't told anyone my specific route. Wahali, please, I'm hurt. The voice was coming from directly ahead, but I could see through the laurel grove. There was no one there. That's when I understood. Something was using my name to try to lure me deeper into the forest, away from any hope of backup or escape, something that could mimic human voices but didn't quite understand how humans actually spoke. I backed away slowly, knife still drawn, and keyed my radio. Dispatch, I need you to confirm the location of all SR personnel. All teams are still en route to your location, Wahali. Why? Something's calling my name out here, and it's not human. There was a long pause before Sarah responded. Copy that. Continue your search, but maintain extreme caution. Report any other anomalies immediately. The voices stopped abruptly, as if whatever was making them had realized its deception had failed. But the unnatural silence continued, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the rustle of my gear. I circled around the laurel grove, giving it a wide berth, and picked up the Martineau's trail on the far side. Their tracks were clear. My radio crackled. Wahali, we just got another report. Campers near Forney Ridge heard someone calling for help about the pieces clicked together. Whatever was out here wasn't just mimicking random voices. It was actively hunting, using the calls to separate people from their groups to lure them into the deep forest where no one would find them. But why hadn't it taken the Henderson family? Why had they been protected instead of harmed? I followed the stream for another half-mile, the tracks becoming fresher as I went. The Martineaus couldn't be far ahead, but neither could whatever was stalking them. The stream led to a small waterfall cascading into a clear pool surrounded by ancient hemlocks, and there, sitting on a fallen log beside the water, were Paul and Susan Martineau. They were alive, but something was terribly wrong. They sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead with empty expressions. When I called their names, they didn't respond. They didn't even seem to see me. I approached carefully, scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of movement. The massive tracks circled the clearing multiple times, but didn't lead away. Paul? Susan? I'm Ranger Amadahi. You're safe now. Susan blinked slowly and turned toward me. Her eyes were unfocused, pupils dilated despite the dim light filtering through the trees. The singing, she whispered. It's so beautiful. Listen to the singing. I strained my ears but heard nothing except the sound of water over stone. Paul spoke without looking at me. We have to stay. It wants us to stay and listen to the singing. This was beyond anything in my training. The Martineaus were physically unharmed, but seemed to be in some kind of trance. I'd heard of psychological trauma causing dissociative states, but this felt different, more deliberate. I knelt in front of Susan and looked directly into her eyes. Susan, I need you to listen to my voice. You're in the Smoky Mountains. You've been missing for 2 days. Your family is worried about you. For a moment her expression cleared. Ranger, how did you? We were just hiking. We stopped for lunch by this pretty waterfall. And then, her face went blank again. The singing. Don't you hear the singing? That's when I heard it too. Not singing exactly, but a low harmonic sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was barely audible, felt more than heard, but it had an almost hypnotic quality. The longer I listened, the more I wanted to sit down beside the Martineaus and just rest. I forced myself to look away from the waterfall and focus on my breathing. Whatever this was, it was affecting my mind as well as theirs. I grabbed Paul's arm and pulled him to his feet. He was surprisingly light, as if he'd lost weight during his 2 days missing. We're leaving, now. But the singing... There is no singing, I shouted, and for a moment the spell seemed to break. Paul blinked and looked around as if seeing the forest for the first time. Where are we? Susan, what happened to our packs? I looked around and realized their backpacks were nowhere to be seen. No camping gear, no supplies. They'd been sitting in this clearing for 2 days with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The harmonic sound grew louder, and I felt that terrible urge to sit down and listen. But beneath it I caught something else. The sound of movement in the forest around us. Multiple creatures moving through the undergrowth, circling our position. I drew my grandfather's knife and pulled out the piece of mica my grandmother had given me. She'd told me it was sacred to our people, used in ceremonies to confuse evil spirits. Gadohi envy, Gavuhi gesti. I spoke the old words, the ones my grandmother had taught me for protection. Aniskayanvi digatayasti. The harmonic sound faltered, became discordant, and in that moment of silence I heard something that made my blood freeze. Children's voices, high and frightened, calling for help from somewhere deeper in the forest. The college students, Rebecca, David, and Alex. But I couldn't leave the Martinos. In their current state, they'd wander back to the waterfall and sit down to wait for whatever was hunting them to return. I made a decision that went against every principle of wilderness rescue. I grabbed the emergency beacon from my belt and activated it, then clipped it to Paul Martineau's jacket. Listen to me, I told them both, speaking slowly and clearly. Stay together. Follow the stream downhill. Don't stop for anything. Don't listen to any voices or sounds except mine on the radio. When the SACR team finds you, tell them Ranger Amadahi has gone after the college students. Susan grabbed my arm with surprising strength. Don't go toward the singing. It's beautiful, but it's wrong. It makes you forget who you are. I keyed my radio. Dispatch. I've located the Martineaus at coordinates. I read off my GPS position. They're alive but disoriented. Emergency beacon is active. I'm continuing search for the second missing party. Before Sarah could respond, I was already moving deeper into the forest, following the sound of those terrified young voices. The trees grew larger as I climbed away from the stream. Ancient giants that had stood when my ancestors first walked these mountains. Spanish moss hung like tattered curtains from their branches, and the air itself seemed thicker, older. The children's voices continued, always just ahead, always just out of sight. But I'd learned my lesson. I didn't follow them directly. Instead, I paralleled their sound, using every tracking skill my grandfather had taught me to search for physical signs of the missing students. I found their campsite in a small clearing beside a seasonal creek. 3 backpacks arranged in a neat triangle, sleeping bags laid out with military precision, camp stove set up but unused. Everything was too perfect, too organized. It looked like a display in an outdoor equipment store rather than a real campsite. The college students were nowhere to be seen, but their tracks were everywhere. Panicked footprints leading away from the campsite in 3 different directions, as if they'd run from something in the middle of setting up camp. I chose the clearest trail and followed it through increasingly dense undergrowth. The footprints belonged to someone running in blind panic, stumbling and recovering, crashing through bushes and around trees. The trail led to another clearing, this one dominated by a massive oak tree that must have been standing when the Cherokee first settled in these mountains. And there, carved into its trunk, were symbols I recognized from my grandmother's stories. They weren't Cherokee symbols. They were older, deeper, scratched into the bark by something with claws rather than tools. The scratches formed a rough spiral pattern that seemed to move when I looked at it directly, drawing the eye inward toward some central point that my mind couldn't quite focus on. Below the tree, barely visible in the dim light, was a dark opening in the earth. Not a natural cave, but something that had been dug or worn by the passage of large bodies over countless years. The children's voices were coming from below ground. I'd found where the forest spirits, or whatever they really were, made their home. Standing at the edge of that dark opening, I understood that everything was connected. The Henderson family's rescue, the Martineaus' trance-like state, the college students' disappearance. Something ancient lived in these mountains. Something that had been here long before humans arrived. And now it was changing its behavior, becoming more aggressive, more dangerous. I thought of my grandmother's words. The old spirits are stirring, Ujidota. The world is changing too fast, and they don't understand their place in it anymore. Below ground, a young woman screamed, not in fear but in agony. I clipped a fresh emergency beacon to the oak tree and activated it, then spoke into my radio. Dispatch. I've found evidence of the missing students. Uploading GPS coordinates now. Tell the SR teams to bring cave rescue equipment, and I hesitated knowing how this would sound. Tell them to bring weapons. Then I took my grandfather's knife in one hand my flashlight in the other, and descended into the darkness where something older than memory was calling my name in a child's voice. The hunt had become personal. The tunnel descended at a steep angle, its walls worn smooth by the passage of countless bodies over what must have been centuries. My flashlight beam revealed scratch marks in the stone. Not random gouges, but deliberate patterns that reminded me of the Cherokee syllabary my grandmother had taught me. If the syllabary had been written by claws instead of pen. The air grew thick and humid as I descended, carrying scents of earth and decay mixed with something else, something musky and wild that I'd smelled once before, at the mouth of the cave where I'd found the Henderson family. 20 feet down, the tunnel opened into a natural cavern large enough to hold a small house. My flashlight revealed smooth limestone walls covered in more of those claw-scratched symbols, patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in the dancing beam of light. And there, huddled against the far wall, were Rebecca Chen, David Martinez, and Alex Thompson. They were alive, but like the Martinos, something was terribly wrong. They sat in a perfect line, backs against the stone, staring at something in the center of the cavern that my light couldn't quite illuminate. Their breathing was synchronized, rising and falling together as if controlled by some external rhythm. Rebecca, David, Alex, I called softly. None of them responded. I moved closer, keeping my back to the wall and scanning the shadows beyond my flashlight's reach. In the center of the cavern, where the students were staring, was a raised stone platform covered in what looked like offerings, bones arranged in careful patterns, dried plants I recognized as traditional Cherokee medicine, and stranger things I couldn't identify. Alex turned his head toward me with mechanical precision. His eyes were completely black, pupils dilated so wide that no iris remained visible. "You shouldn't have come here," he said in a voice that wasn't entirely his own. It carried harmonics, overtones that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "This is a sacred place, older than your people, older than memory." I drew my grandfather's knife and held it where Alex could see it. The bone handle gleamed white in the flashlight beam, carved with symbols that matched some of those on the cavern walls. Recognition flickered in those black eyes. "You carry the old blood," the voice said. "You know the proper words. Why do you come with steel and fire instead of gifts and respect?" I understood then. The cave, the offerings, the symbols. This wasn't just a lair, it was a shrine. And whatever inhabited it expected the same reverence that Cherokee holy places commanded. "I've come for my people," I said carefully, speaking both in English and Cherokee. "Anivuya-gadohi, Nigadohi Nigado." A sound echoed from the deeper darkness beyond the platform. Not the harmonic singing I'd heard above ground, but something closer to laughter. Ancient, knowing laughter that held no warmth. "Your people." The voice came from everywhere at once now, not just from Alex's mouth. "Your people are the ones who came from across the great water, who brought iron and disease and the sound of falling trees. We were here when your ancestors first crossed the ice bridge. We were here when the Cherokee learned to grow corn and build towns. We are older than your oldest stories." Movement in the shadows behind the platform resolved into a shape that challenged every scientific principle I'd ever learned. The creature stepped into my flashlight beam with deliberate slowness, and I understood why the Henderson children had called it the Fuzzy Man. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its face was a mixture of human and something else. Intelligent eyes set in features that were both ancient and alien. When it opened its mouth, I saw teeth that belonged in no taxonomy textbook, but it was the intelligence in those eyes that truly frightened me. This wasn't some primitive relic. This was something that had been watching, learning, adapting to human presence for countless generations. "You want your people," the creature said, and now I could see that it was speaking through Alex while simultaneously producing its own voice from somewhere deeper in its throat. "But they are happy here. They dream beautiful dreams and hear the songs of the earth. Why would you take them back to your loud, sharp world?" I looked at the 3 students. They were thinner than they should be after only 2 days missing, and their skin had a grayish pallor that spoke of something essential being slowly drained away. "Because it's not your choice to make," I said firmly. "They have families, lives, futures waiting for them." The creature tilted its massive head. "Futures in your dying world. Your people poison the streams and cut the old trees. Your machines make such noise that the animals forget their songs. What kind of future is that? There was genuine sadness in its voice, and I began to understand something my grandmother had tried to teach me about the old spirits. They weren't evil, they were lost. The world had changed around them so fast that they no longer knew how to exist in it. The world is changing, I admitted. But taking people won't stop that. It will only bring more of us into your sacred places, with more machines and more noise. The creature made a sound like wind through ancient trees. Then what would you have us do? Fade away like morning mist? Let the last wild places become roads and houses? I thought of my grandmother's words about balance, about the Cherokee concept of Duchuk Teve, the right relationship between all living things. Share the wild places, I said. Teach us to remember what we've forgotten. But do it willingly, with respect, not by stealing our people. The creature was silent for a long moment, its ancient eyes studying me. Around the cavern, I could see other shapes moving in the darkness. Smaller creatures, a whole community of beings that had lived in these mountains since before human memory. You speak like the old ones, it finally said. The Cherokee who knew the proper ways. But how can we trust that your people will listen? How can we trust that they won't bring their iron and fire to cleanse these places of all mystery? I reached into my pocket and pulled out the piece of mica my grandmother had given me, along with the small pouch of traditional tobacco I always carried. Moving slowly, I approached the offering platform and placed both items among the bones and plants already there. Sky ha yo duvi, I said, using the old Cherokee words for be blessed. Negada anivwia. The creature's eyes widened. You know the old prayers. My grandmother taught me. She said the spirits of the mountains would need our help someday, just as we would need theirs. I gestured to the 3 students. These young ones, they're not the enemy. They came here to study the forest, to learn about the natural world. Let me take them back and I'll find a way to bring the right people here. People who understand the old ways. The creature moved closer, and I forced myself not to step back. Up close, I could see intelligence in its features that was unsettling in its depth. This being had been watching human civilization develop, had seen empires rise and fall, had witnessed the slow destruction of the wild places it called home. If I release your people, it said slowly, how do I know you'll keep your word? How do I know you won't return with others who carry iron instead of respect? I thought of everything my grandmother had taught me about the Cherokee way, about the importance of Duuk TV, the balance between all living things, about the responsibility that came with being a bridge between the old world and the new. Because I am an Ijudawagi, I said, using the old Cherokee word for mountain dweller. Because my people and your people have shared these mountains for countless generations. Because the earth itself will hold me to my promise. The creature studied me for another long moment, then made a gesture I didn't understand. The 3 students blinked in unison, and color began returning to their faces. Rebecca shook her head as if waking from a deep dream. What? Where are we? You're safe, I told her. We're leaving now. As I helped the students to their feet, the creature spoke one more time. Remember your promise, Enijitawagi. The old places grow smaller each year. Soon there will be nowhere left for us to sing the earth songs. I'll remember, I promised. The tunnel leading out seemed shorter than it had going down. But by the time we reached the surface, the 3 students were moving under their own power. The fresh mountain air seemed to clear the last of whatever influence had held them. My radio crackled to life as soon as we emerged. Wohali, say our teams are converging on your location. What's your status? I have all 3 missing students. We're coming out. The debriefing took hours. The students remembered very little. Hiking into the forest, setting up camp, then waking up in the cave with no memory of how they'd gotten there. The Martinos had similar gaps in their recollection. The official report mentioned possible exposure to unknown biological agents causing temporary disorientation. No mention of creatures, caves, or promises made to beings older than human memory. But that night I called my grandmother. I met them, I told her simply. She was quiet for a long time. And I told her everything about the creature in the cave, the promise I'd made, the responsibility I'd accepted to be a bridge between 2 worlds. Your grandfather would be proud, she said finally. He always said you carried the old blood strong. The spirits have been waiting for someone like you. someone who could walk in both worlds. But how do I keep my promise? How do I find people who will respect the old places without destroying them? The same way our people always have, she said. One person at a time, one story at a time. You plant seeds of understanding and wait for them to grow. Over the following weeks, I began that work. I reached out to Cherokee elders, to traditional storytellers, to scientists who studied the connection between indigenous knowledge and conservation. Slowly, carefully, I began to build a network of people who might understand what I'd experienced in that cave. But the real change came from an unexpected source. Rebecca Chen contacted me 6 months later. She'd been having dreams, she said. Dreams of ancient forests and creatures that sang to the earth. She'd switched her major from business to environmental science and was writing her thesis on the intersection of folklore and ecology. I know this sounds crazy, she told me over coffee in Gatlinburg, but I think what happened to us in the mountains was real, and I think it's important. David Martinez had similar experiences, as did Alex Thompson. All three had been profoundly affected by their time in the cave. Even if they couldn't remember the details, they'd become advocates for wilderness preservation, for respecting indigenous knowledge, for listening to voices that had been ignored for too long. The seeds of understanding were beginning to grow. A year after my encounter in the cave, I was leading a small group of Cherokee elders and sympathetic researchers into the deep backcountry. We carried offerings instead of equipment, respect instead of weapons. At the oak tree with the spiral symbols carved into its bark, I called out in Cherokee, Osio, Edohi, Gadohi, Invihi. The response came not from below ground, but from the forest around us. Multiple voices, ancient and knowing, singing in harmonies that predated human civilization. The work of building bridges between worlds had begun. The Kekla were ready to share their songs again, and humanity, at least some of us, was finally ready to listen. As I stood in that sacred grove, surrounded by beings from two different worlds learning to trust each other again, I understood what my grandmother had meant about carrying the old blood. Some responsibilities are inherited not through genetics, but through the willingness to stand in the spaces between worlds and hold them together. The mountains remembered everything, and now they were ready to teach their lessons to anyone wise enough to listen. The forest had found its voice again, and I was honored to be its translator.